Hello, everybody. I am Nerd Slayer, the host of Six Pixels Under. This is episode 40 of the podcast, and I'd like to first welcome everybody to the podcast and also joining me. If you can't tell today, I've been messing around with some of the assets, so if you're looking at some things and maybe things aren't where you left them, I'm just messing around with ideas of kind of where to move things at. And playing around with the idea of putting me in the center, I kind of like that idea a lot. Not because I care so much about myself, but it's nice when everything's kind of centered together. Anyway, how's everybody doing on this Monday? It's the 1st of July, so that's always exciting whenever it's the turning of a month. I'll be completely honest with you guys. I didn't really script a whole lot that I'm going to work on today. So instead of like worrying too much about what I scripted to go over, or like jumping down the rabbit hole of whatever particular topic is trending for the week, I think instead I can talk to you guys. First, let me let everybody know about the MMO Roundtable before I even get into any of this, which is going to happen a little bit later in the podcast. In the MMO Roundtable, if you're not familiar with it, essentially the way it works is it's a conglomerate or gathering of the community where everybody gets a voice. You get to join voice chat, and we get to all talk about a particular topic. This week's topic is going to be, and has been rather, because I put it out ahead of time in the text channel, the MMO Roundtable on my Discord, just in case, just so people kind of, can talk about the ideas and play with the ideas. But the current topic at the moment is, what is a good system or feature from a sandbox MMO and why? And then sandbox, as I define, is an MMO that primarily relies on player interactions and content to create content. So tools are in the hands of the players, essentially. So what is a great example of such, sort of? Another caveat to that question. So I'll post that in chat just so everybody is aware. But yeah, so that we're going to get to that a little bit later. So if you have the desire to join the voice chat and add anything, maybe you have a particular example you would like to bring up, go ahead and do that. Now, there's one thing I'll get into just right now. And by the way, anything you guys want to talk about today, I'm flirting around with the idea of us kind of just figuring it out as we go. But also, I wanted to have a longer MMO section today, because one thing I was kind of realizing when I was talking to Big Boss, actually, in chat last week, was that we don't do enough theory crafting when it comes to MMOs, and I think that should be done more often. We should have some more theory crafting. I like doing it, when we play around with the ideas of how would you make an MMO in this franchise? How would you make an MMO in this franchise? That sort of stuff. I think the core of this show has and will always be multiplayer games and MMOs, because that's just what is most interesting to me. So we have to find more opportunities to discuss such and talk about such. At the end of the podcast, there's the call-in segment where you can ask me any questions at me in chat, and then you can also talk to me in Discord. Today's podcast is going to run shorter because I didn't really script a whole lot. So again, it's going to go as long as essentially you guys wanted to go within the time period of 2 hours. Yeah, so as Carde said, by the way, we're still looking for a podcast aide to help out with the podcast, to help gather questions, to help set people up in the lobby, so you have them in order for whenever the next person comes in and asks a question, and then also potentially can work on timestamps. That's one of my biggest things that's annoying at the moment right now, is I have to do my podcast and then rewatch it myself and then do all the timestamps, when if somebody just watches it live with me, they could just write down each time I'm talking about a new subject. And that'd be an easier way of doing it. It's like I could do it, but then I have to manage that, the chat, the stream, the camera, do I look like I'm Blaze? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like I have to balance a lot of different things. I would rule out empty worlds that the players have to build the bases of the term sandbox. Yeah, I kept it a little bit kind of generalistic. If you want to nail down the brass tacks, I guess, of what I consider to be a sandbox MMO. We've talked about it on the Discord before. I think Lemposs probably remembers the exact quote, but it was persistence, right? There has to be a persistence. There has to be a massive amount of players, and that's kind of in quotations because it depends, right? Scale, I guess, if you want to call it that. And then what was the last thing we said? It was like one more thing. I can't remember what it was. Have I seen the crafting system originally introduced with PoE? I have not. Yes, I don't know which one in particular you're talking about. Are you talking about like the grid system, or is that skill system and not the crafting system? Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into this really quickly because I just saw this and I was kind of curious about it. There's some new open world survival game that somebody just posted. That's a Kickstarter. It's called Raw, I guess, or Project Raw, I guess is what they're calling it. And when I watched the trailer, I just wanted to point something out to you guys. I don't know nothing about this game. I don't know nothing. I don't know much about this game. Raw. Clearly, they're trying to establish some sort of premise here. The thing that I immediately noticed from watching this is just like, obviously, if this is gameplay, it's a very specific kind of gameplay. The textures look a little bit kind of like washy, if that makes sense. And that kind of, to me, implies that it's not as graphically intensive as a game as maybe it might seem at first glance. But this is supposed to be, this Raw game is another kind of entry into the whole idea of like almost like a real life simulator. And I'm not going to sit there and say that you're going to be doing what that guy was just doing in real life, but just it simulates the real life because you have a workplace, you could, you know, work for the police, you could be a tow truck driver as it's showing right now. Like there's a number of different things that you could work. And this idea and concept has existed now for, of course, a while, but blew up with like Arma mod Altus Life. Altus Life made that big, and then I think Altus Life made its own standalone at some point, or they're currently working on it. Then we had that other game, wasn't it? What was that other one called? Identity, I think, that they were trying to also build this similar sort of game where it's like a real life simulator. I just want to talk about real life simulators because obviously the concept is not new at this point. People are probably aware of real life simulators, but one thing I want to point out is that I think that they're very interesting because oftentimes they end up being more fun than the real world. And it's like, you might ask a question, if this is supposed to be modeled after the real world, why is the real world not more fun in some cases? And I think it's because obviously, you know, a game is a game, and what that means is that on a basic intrinsic level, it's about enjoyment. So it's not zero sum, if that makes sense. Like, not a whole lot of video games are zero sum. Like, life can be zero sum. Sometimes you just lose and there's no winning. Right? Sometimes you took a loss and you're not gonna learn the lesson from it. You know, like sometimes it's just kind of hard like that. In a video game, it's not a zero sum. You know, like you're not just losing everything whenever you try, even if you lose, right? Because you get to try again, and you get to try again, and you get to try again. There hasn't really been a dedicated real life simulator, has it? No, there hasn't, and that's kind of what I'm exploring. Is, you know, people talk about GTA. Obviously, Red Dead's more recent online multiplayer doesn't seem to be picking up as much as GTA. But I think that, you know, you look at those games and you see the power and potential of them. And I remember playing GTA 4 online. Like, that's how OG I am. I remember I was playing, like, the old GTA. And I loved playing Cops and Crooks in that game. That game was so fun. Cops and Crooks was so hilarious because you could do one for all or all for one. So either you had one mob boss or all of you were a boss. And I hated that one. Because then everyone would just, like, betray each other and it was fun. But whenever you did one for all, you have like one boss and you have to protect them, so it ends up becoming really fun, you know. And you look at, like Lemposs is saying, actually the GTA RP scene's pretty big, like it's still around. And so I guess the train of thought I'm trying to follow here, guys, is why hasn't there been a bigger scaled open world survival game, or if you want to keep it in the same vein of what we're saying now, like a real life simulator? And obviously the first thing that you're going to say is probably going to be, that's a good point. Ginger Spice brought up Second Life. Second Life's a really big one, right? But here's my argument now that you brought up Second Life. Second Life is pretty damn old. I mean, it's like 03 or 04. So it's kind of like, how come there hasn't been like the newer one since then? I'm just trying to put the pieces together and wonder why more people aren't seeing the value in such a model that Second Life did. And maybe it's because it's kind of esoteric. Maybe it's because people don't really see the value of such. But riddle me this, Batman. I'm just kidding. But Listen to this. What if that kind of situation is a perfect opportunity to also introduce an augmented reality, or also introduce virtual reality? And yes, virtual chats work. I'm not trying to say they don't, but I'm saying, like, what if you can create the next generation Second Life and then also tie in these augmented bits of reality and also virtual reality? Sort of like, yeah, that's a good point. I would agree with that, Lemposs. Simulators like that aren't in the scope of a lot of devs. Yeah, I mean, it's probably one of the more difficult things to create, right? Because if you're going to make a real life simulator, you kind of have to be like on with the details. Otherwise, it's like, I don't know about you guys, but if there was a feature in the game where I could brush my teeth, and when I went to brush my teeth, it made me brush my teeth for like 5 solid minutes, and that was the only way to do it, it would kind of annoy me, because it's like, dude, who brushes their teeth for like 5 minutes? Nobody's doing it for. You know what I'm saying? And obviously I'm using like a pedantic example on purpose just to illustrate, like, it gets to that point once you start to make things realistic. You know, once you start to make military sims, people are going to pick it apart logically and be like, well, this thing, like, you know, like, this needs to be more realistic for me. Let me control my toothbrush, you know? Like, I want motion controls on my toothbrush. Like, you know, some people are going to just say, why not bring it to the level? And so I'm just bringing up virtual reality. Maybe that's the next level for the real life simulator. I think for a good real life simulator, you are looking at Star Citizen levels of work and detail and perhaps more. Just different, but work wise, probably in the same. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, it ends up being one of those things where you're absolutely going to have a big team. There's no way around it, because you have to make your game very detail centric. If your game's not detail centric, it's just gonna feel like shitty life. You know what I'm saying? Like, when realism is your standard, that's a high standard. That's kind of why I think realism is overrated in video, because it's like, you don't want to be beholds to the rules essentially that we know, and also to the rules we don't know, right? Because there are things obviously that science hasn't figured out, and so it's like, when you can make it more fantasy, or like, you know, just on fiction, I guess, or actually make it fiction instead of nonfiction, that you introduce a whole another layer of complexities to it, for sure. It would be the ultimate expression of the bitch is in the details. Oh yeah, absolutely. GTA RP is lacking a ton of things that could aid in the RP, and that's sort of the problem in a lot of MMOs that I would encounter. It's that MMOs, as time went on, MMOs became less and less roleplay friendly, which is just interesting to me. And I brought this up before, but in my opinion, the idea surrounding roleplay and what it means in MMOs has sort of been undersold. And what I mean by that is, and I'm gonna make a video about this at some point, but obviously, if you guys remember the term MMO RPG, like, role-playing game is kind of in the title. So role-playing, you know, in that sense, to go back to the old OG sense of it, was kind of just like, you create a character and then you pretend to be that character. So you're pretending to take things on from the perspective of that character that. And obviously, those games early on didn't like enforce you to role play, but that was kind of expected, right? People kind of expected in some way you were kind of role playing, as like, you're in this other world, and that was automatically already feeling wow. Especially early on, when we couldn't just notice everything in the same way that we do now, because we hadn't experienced such a game before. And I just remember, like, back in those days, role-playing was part of basically every core community. I mean, you look at early core communities for all of the biggest games, and they all had big audiences for the role-playing communities. What I noticed, though, is over time, as these other world aspects and these other kind of, you know, maybe the push towards more theme park style games started to happen, you noticed like a decrease in the acceptance and kind of like popularity of the role-playing audience. And the interesting thing that I'm trying to postulate to you guys today is that you might think that's because, oh, those players just, you know, stopped playing MMOs and they just disappeared. They became a statistic. I'm going to postulate that I actually think that they just went and started playing tabletop games. And I feel like after my time spent at a tabletop event and talking to people about this very subject, they kind of echoed my sentiment, which is like, hey, we like MMOs. We like this MMO. We like that Dungeons and Dragons has an MMO, and that Neverwinter has an MMO, and that Galaxies. Like they would bring up these different games, but they would say, but they're lacking these features that I need and want as a roleplay fan. And whenever they would bring up a lot of their criticisms to me, what I found most interesting about it is that I couldn't really deny it. It was kind of like, I mean, you're right. And I remember I went through the example of creating a character, and it made me realize, man, the level of depth it's just not there yet in MMOs. It hasn't been there, and it kind of trended away from that. We lost a lot of depth. They started taking away numbers and statistics. They don't want to show us what the exact numbers are now. Now it's healing power and just like very generic kind of statistics. People don't tell us population data anymore. People don't even release like full expansions besides, Elder Scrolls these days. Final Fantasy 14. Like, the point being is like things have changed, right? It's not content isn't distributed the way that it used to be distributed. So while I think that could affect like story, for example, I think with role playing, it's just a matter of, because MMOs cease to be the place for role players to enjoy and kind of like cultivate, they went back to what they kind of started with in the first place, which was pen and paper, just Dungeons and Dragons. And so the role-playing fans still exist. And this is where I'm going to make the argument that MMOs not recognizing them is such a massive mistake. Not only can role players be the best customers because they're willing to spend long-term amounts of money, big amounts of money, in whatever, particular nerd fandom that they have, right? I can confirm that myself. I mean, look at like what I have on the wall. Like nerds will go to the umpteenth level, right, in order to collect the things that they really want to collect. And so why wouldn't you want like a role player as a fan? I mean, a role player is the nerd, right? The role player is the nerd, not a nerd, the nerd. It's the original nerd. Thanks for the subscription, JST Link. I appreciate that. Welcome to the Noir Club. Here's your tip. Appreciate it. Oh, also, Dead Earth, thank you for the subscription or resubscription. Welcome back to the Noir Club. I appreciate it. There's your tip. Anyway, so role-playing fans, they're disenfranchised. They don't want to play MMOs anymore because they have no community to go to, no games to go to. And you might say, but there was games. Why not go role-play in those games? Well, as somebody had brought up previously, and I can't remember who in chat, you need the tools in order to do that. If you don't give people tools, you're going to make it really difficult. You're going to make it difficult for them to create the kind of stories that they want to create. And here's the conundrum, guys. If you don't have role players in your game, then your game's not going to be able to create the kind of content that you need in order for it to keep having longevity. Because if you're only going to rely on longevity being based on the developers and the content made by the developers, you're creating a very risky endeavor. This has been proven too many times in my series, and you can go watch those videos and check it yourself. Too many times these games have essentially put themselves in a situation where it's like, no longer when you're pandering or even just like acknowledging your role-playing audience, you are now basing your game around the idea that your contained content within the quest, like the storylines, the raids and stuff, is gonna be enough on its own merit to carry your game and to keep enough longevity in your game. But the problem is that it isn't the case, guys. I said this on the podcast last time. MMORPG without the massive part, it doesn't really work in the same way, right? Like it loses a part of itself. So when you're no longer focusing on the multiplayer aspects, your game is going to look inferior compared to other games. Perfect example of this. Why do people want to consider Path of Exile an MMO? Because it's kicking MMO's ass. Because it's kicking all the other MMO's ass. That's why. Because it's one of the best free-to-play games out there. Free-to-play multiplayer games out there. People want to call it an MMO because it's like, I mean, it has some of the same factors, and I mean, it's kind of better than these other games, so why isn't it, why don't you consider this to be an MMO? And anyway, to go back to what I was saying earlier. Oh, JST Link said, what? Won't use Patreon, but I'll hit you up on here. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Granted, I'm also of the opinion that people can be a bit too fast giving up Going in with an intent can do a lot. Well, yeah, no, and look, I want to completely agree with Lemposs. That a lot of times the communities have been kind of jaded. They kind of give up too easily, and I've been there. I've been along for the ride where everyone's excited for a given game, and they're like, yeah, like the role-playing community, we're gonna do all this work, and then they get into it, and they're kind of jaded that things aren't exactly how they wanted it to be, and then they kind of leave, right? And it's like, I agree with that. You have to, as a community, especially like in the context of a game where, you know, conflict is the central thing, or faction warfare is the central thing, you need to create a world in which people actually care about that. And I know it sounds strange, but it's like, some people watching me are probably like, man, I don't even roleplay. Roleplaying's like for sissies or whatever people are saying these days. But it's kind of like, well, first off, that's not true, because I'll push your shit in any PvP game. Second off, I've been PvPing since I was a young boy, all right? And I've also been roleplaying since I was a young boy. You can do them both. The reason why role-playing matters, even as a PvPer, the reason why it matters is it's just pixels, guys. What else am I doing it for? It's just pixels, right? If I'm looting stuff and I'm getting all this cool gear, oh, wow, awesome. It's just pixel. It doesn't really mean anything, right? It doesn't mean anything in itself. The reward doesn't really mean anything in itself. It's the process of going through the work put in to get the reward, right? And then you get the reward and you're like, wow, that's awesome. I earned that myself. Like, I put that effort in and I got that. The economy and crafting system is just brilliant in Path of Exile. Same with the community and socializing. You need to give a little yourself, not just the forum, the perfect game that won't exist. Yeah, no, I completely agree. You have to be willing to put effort in. And that's one thing that, like, you look at the way that we're trying to go about our WoW Classic clan, is that we are going to create conflict. And I mean, as Ginger can attest to in chat, even with very little of our troops in Legends of Aria, we created a lot of drama, okay? And that's what you're supposed to do in these kind of games, because it's not about exploiting, it's not about cheating, it's not about hacking, or it's not about griefing. Remember, we had the discussion about the distinction between ganking and griefing last time on the podcast? It's not about any of that. It's about, we need to take the world seriously so the world functions in the best way possible. And so what I mean by that is that if everybody goes into the game with the idea that, hey, I'm going to be my character, what you actually do is you raise the bar for everybody in terms of enjoyment and gameplay. Immersion aspect, right? Because now everybody's taking it. And now you're like, man, it's kind of like when you play D&D, right? When everybody takes it seriously and everyone's trying and everyone's, man, what do I do? And like really into it because they care, it makes for a more enjoyable experience. And so it's like the same thing I think of in this case. It's like in an MMO, you need that aspect because it makes it over. It's like the whole, you know, the rising tide raises all boats or whatever. It's kind of that thing. Like the tide is being raised whenever the community comes together and is role playing and creates that kind of content, because it's integral in the game. And so I think, to go back to what I was saying earlier about how role-playing players have been kind of left in the past, it's finally too hot for a long shirt. Yeah, it was, dude. I'm sorry, Braz Monkey. It's too hot here in Austin at the moment. It's like 90-something out there, man, and I'm burning in here. If others take it serious, it's also easy. Exactly, Lemposs. And that's the thing is like, it's a matter of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why I keep shouting out, you know, to everybody every time I talk about playing WoW, is that, guys, we're going to make content. It's going to be fun. You don't have to worry about that. That's a guarantee, because that's the only reason I want to play the game. To have fun. I'm going to create content. That's just how I work, is like, the reason why I don't just play MMOs really casually is that I like to be all in. You know, I want to feel like I'm really engaged and I'm really, hey, it's that guy again. I remember seeing him level at level 30, and you know, hey, it's that guild again. I remember that guild. Or, oh, I don't like this clan because of these politics. And like, I want that worldly feel, if that makes sense. The immersion that comes with it. Guild duel rankings, yeah, we can do that for sure. In fact, I'm gonna have a lot of work to do because I have no experience against playing against mages as a hunter, and no experience playing against what's it? I think that's the main one that at the moment I feel really like iffy about. It's a hard matchup already, and since I'm not like where I want to be in terms of my skill in that game yet, because I haven't played enough, I'm afraid of mages. So Alondras, the idea is going to be that we want to pressure Blizzard into making an RP PvP server, which is why I'm working on this. Check this out. See that? I won't show you exactly what I'm working on, but like what I've put in so far. But I'm gonna put a video and I'm gonna go address Blizzard directly. I'm gonna @ Blizzard on Twitter. I'm gonna post it in the subreddit. I'm gonna put it on every channel possible, and it's just going to be a big argument of why you should make RP PvP servers. And trust me, I'm gonna pull out every trick I have in the briefcase and every trick under the fedora. And I'm gonna use the brain under the fedora to try and bring them to their knees, all right? So I'm gonna pull out all the data. I'm gonna look back at the dates, see how the servers did back then, how they're doing now, look at role-playing servers on retail, make the comparisons between those and the old servers, talk about how the recent polling data that's coming out is showing that RP PvP is looking like it's more popular at the moment. Talk about how the central theme of the game is faction warfare. So why not make your roleplay game also PvP? Because if you want to roleplay PvE, you can do that on a PvE server, but it doesn't really work the same on a PvP server, because PvP server, as you guys can imagine, is just PvP. So, and with PvP, you do need the backing of roleplay and the protection of a lot that comes with the community that plays role-playing games, in my opinion, in order for it to properly work as an immersive game. So I think RP PvP is kind of like, that has to be the server. Personally speaking, I'm biased. There was RP PvP back in the day, so that's something that's like commonly said that's not true. There was an RP PvP at launch. There was an RP PvP at 1.12. There was RP PvP at 1.18, which is not that much further along. In fact, it's before TBC. So they had RP PvP before TBC even came out. Like Emerald Dawn and a couple of those other servers are ancient, dude. They're old as hell. So although it wasn't there at launch, it was added. And by the way, still to this day, those are popular servers. So the point is that those servers have existed and have existed for some time. And there was a precedent already. Some people want to bring up the argument that, well, RP PvP servers weren't there at launch. Okay, that's fair. But do we want to have that argument? Because there's other things that weren't there at launch either. Do we talk about like the nice fancy screens we have and this nice fancy microphone and fedora? I didn't have any of this shit last time the game came out. Like, things have changed, obviously. Technology has changed. We're not getting the perfect classic experience. Not to mention, at this point, we can look back and learn a bit from previous experiences and see that what's the point in launching an RP server if there's more players who want to play on an RP PvP server? It's kind of like this. At that point, it's like, yeah, they could keep it that way because that's how it was in classic, but they'd be kind of shooting themselves in the foot, because a lot of people won't play if they don't have an RP PvP server. I can tell you this because this is confirmed on the very forums itself. Many people are saying, like, if there's no RP PvP server, I'm not a big enough fan to just come back to the game otherwise. So for many of them, it's like they just want the idea that, hey, like, I can really go for the Horde and Alliance, and I think that's what people want. They want that struggle. Now, I'm not going to say that everybody wants the struggle. Obviously, plenty of people want to play on the PvE servers. The PvE servers are probably going to be pretty populated, right? Probably more populated than PvP servers. But I would also make the argument that essentially what is unique about a PvP server versus a RP PvP? I'll give you a hint. There's nothing unique about it, because the RP PvP server has everything the PvP server has, but it also has the RP part. So it's just kind of like hybrids under simple rule systems like that are always better, because it's like you get more things with it. There's no drastic mechanical difference between PvP servers and RP PvPs other than player attitude and name filter. And it's like that's my exact point. It's like, so why not do it? Not really like you're like gonna derail your game or like do something that's gonna completely catch people off guard, right? They didn't care until you put on the fedora. Nobody listened to me. Put on the fedora. Can't go back to classic. Love it back then, but I've experienced better combat systems now. Yeah, I mean, do you really want to start that argument with me? Because, like, guys, I hate MMO combat systems. Not just dislike, I hate them, okay? And I'm going to go into that rant. So let's go ahead and get into the soapbox. Good job, JST Link. You triggered me. Triggered now. All right, so MMO combat systems, right? When it comes to WoW and comparing it to kind of like what's considered the MMO combat standard, if you will, the problem that I have with MMO combat is essentially this. It's that any time you stray away from the tried and true, which is kind of, you know, what WoW is, I'm sorry, just tab target is kind of like tried and true. That was kind of the more popular original way to play games like that. So once you stray away from tab target, you're doing a number of things. You're creating more risk for your game, and you're also creating more ways for your game to be differentiated, which is, you know, a good thing. But then you're also opening up the possibility that perhaps the risk that you take ends up not necessarily being a good one. And what I mean by that is, like, say for example, a game's like, hey, I want to create a an action combat MMO, but then they realize kind of what that actually entails, and they're kind of already committed to it. So now you have this kind of substandard tab target game that also has action combat elements. And if you want me to explain what I mean, I'll be very specific. So what I notice in a lot of these, say for example, more Asian-centric kind of MMOs, is that oftentimes in their combat systems, they have very little ability. There's not a lot of ability. The simple reason for that oftentimes is they have big, fancy, sexy animations. So it's like, it's very expensive to just create like 20, 30 abilities, you know, with that level of production value. Other times, their trees or different like trait systems aren't very varied. So there's not a whole lot of variety in the way that you can play the different classes. The main variety is supposed to be around the idea that it's like an action game. So just like in a fighting game, even if you all play the same generic character, maybe each of you will play it in a different way because you have like a different style. The problem is because it's essentially a neutered fighting game or a neutered action combat game, just by the basis of being kind of, you know, an MMO, but also not being able to offer the same ability that these other action centric games can offer on consoles and PC when they're just single player games. They can't really compare. And so the problem is that the more you stray away from tab target, the more you run into those kind of risks, and they're expensive risks. So I understand why people don't want to make action combat games and physics based MMOs and different things like that, right? Because there's a lot of risk that goes into it. The problem with continuing to make the same kind of game is that if you're going to do the same thing, you kind of have to keep innovating it. Otherwise, it's like, you better do it perfect. So it's kind of like, and you know, my culture and Mexican culture, you make your own tortillas, and let's say you make like a particular kind of barbacoa or something, like the cheek of a cow. Sorry, we love the cheek of cows for some reason. You make this kind of meal and you eat it, you're on your own, and then go and eat that somewhere else. And I'm sure Lions can attest to this in chat. Go eat that at some random, you know, place. It's not the same. It's like you made it yourself. It's totally different, right? It's totally different. Like what I'm saying is that barbacoa taco is perfection, right? And that's why it's existed for hundreds of years, right? That's why the tortilla has existed for that long, because it's like this like bit of perfection that's just like worked and existed. And so what I'm trying to say is that in order to get past that, you have to do kind of innovative things, right? And so people do innovative things. You know, maybe they try a tortilla in a different way, a different kind of flavor. And I've seen many of these, like an ancho chili or like maybe like a tomatillo kind of like tortilla. People try these different kinds of things. So the point is that you can't beat the perfection part, like the original, right? It's like kind of perfection, but you can kind of innovate on it, or at least try like different variations of it. The problem in MMOs and the combat system, and how I'm building this analogy, is that the MMO combat system is kind of like, it's the tortilla, but it's like the tortilla that's like getting worse and worse over time. Which is, remember, when I'm talking about the tortilla is not losing its quality. It's already perfection. It's a simple idea. It's corn pressed, and then it's heated, right? So it's like, it's kind of simple, but it's perfection. It's hard to beat that. It's hard to like say that it's flawed, right? Because it's so simple. But in a combat system, right, you look at tab targets, and it's like, at one point, tab target games, I think, were actually challenging. I truly believe in order to be good at a tab target game at one point in the world, tab target MMO, I should say, there took skill. And I'm not just saying this, though I am a little bit biased because I played, you know, many tab target games where I played my ass off. And I learned a lot and I trained a lot to get good. And I knew it took a lot of skill. Guild Wars 1 is a perfect example. It's not a game people think about with PvP, right? That was one of the most hardcore games I've ever played. I mean, like, the level of players in those games are crazy. You're talking hundreds of builds people are going through. It's just like, imagine in a game where your greatest skill is your brain. And that's kind of what MMOs used to be. It used to be about being smart and having knowledge, right? Knowledge. It's about having knowledge and kind of being smart about the way that you use your abilities and fight certain matchups. And like, did you trinket here? And did you do this here? Like, did you cyclone? Like, you have to like look at all these different things. Like, did you knock them into lava? Did you use knockdown? Did you interrupt? Did you shut your face and silence a dude in the middle of his heal? It was all about kind of like using the right interaction, but not really about reaction time, right? Because it wasn't necessarily about being twitch and being fast. Now, I'm not going to say a kick or an interrupt or a distracting shot from Guild Wars 1. I'm not going to say that doesn't take skill. That's what I played. I played a split ranger, so I was very used to trying to interrupt monks all the time who were spamming protection and spamming heals. So it does take skill, and there's some level of mechanical. But let's not delude ourselves. It's nothing compared to other games like Super Smash Brothers, okay? Like, the technical ability required to play that game is so great, casuals literally just can't play it. Because they're not going to compete against any of the players who put any modicum level of time, right? Because it takes a lot of technical ability. So MMOs were never really about technical ability early on. And so it was about knowledge. It was about knowing kind of the correct reaction, the correct responses. The problem is kind of like, remember the analogy with the tortilla, is over time, that got less and less. There's less abilities, less class choices, less specializations, less variety across the board. And I mean, feel free to debate me on this, guys. Bring up any current MMO example right now, except for like Final Fantasy's like weird out there job system, which I'm not saying is bad, but I'm saying it's like, it's not typical. The job system isn't a typical way to do it. But like, look at these other games, Guild Wars 2, right? Elder Scrolls, even WoW. Like, many of these games have only gotten more simple in terms of the way that their classes function and the customization that you can do with your classes. There's less abilities, less ways to play your class. There's less variety. It's just, to me, that's a big problem, because we're still making tab target games. We're still married to the tab target kind of mentality. And yet, we're losing more and more of what made tab target games good in the first place. So it's like, essentially, we're like with combat, the reason why it triggers me so much is like, we're going backwards. We're going the other direction. We're not in front of things when it comes to innovation at the moment. We're losing these core aspects of what made tab target games fun: the cooldowns, the correct choice of abilities, the specializations, the items, right? Like, classic WoW has brought back the idea of items, like trinkets and different specs and things like that. Like, I remember playing Warhammer, and you could be a tank and use a sword and shield, but still spec DPS, and that was kind of like my thing back in the day. Is I would play like a Black Orc, sword and board, but I'd take like shut your face and tree hit combo, and I'd start messing people up because I was spec pure DPS. Like, that's what I'm talking about, is like, more stuff like that has kind of like lost its way. And then really, if we want to get even more critical, the other thing that's been lacking in tab target games is identity. It's class identity. Class identity is lacking at the moment. Class identity in Warhammer, the reason why Warhammer Online is one of my favorite MMOs, despite being such a train wreck, is that it had class identity in spades. In my opinion, Warhammer Online probably has the best class identity I've personally experienced, maybe besides like one or two other examples that I possibly couldn't even think of right now. You know what I'm saying? Like, maybe Galaxies, but I don't even know if I could make that argument. I thought Warhammer Online had the best class identity. And class identity really, really matters, because I want to feel like I'm playing a Bright Wizard, which is why I thought the whole concept of ruin and combustion was awesome. I want to be able to hurt myself when I'm like casting fireballs and it's like, you know, backlashing me like the sorcerer did, or, you know, when I'm playing a white lion and I can like make my lion pounce and like do all these cool things like that. Like, I want the class flavor. But we're losing class flavor. We're losing the identities. We're losing more options and more variety. And yet people want to say that, like, oh, you know, these action combat games, like, they're so awesome. They're so great. Like, how come you don't love these action combat games? It's like, well, I actually don't even think those action combat games are better than the old tab target game. I don't think they are. And here's my argument. I don't think that games like Black Desert Online, pseudo action games, are better than games, combat systems like WoW. Just because they're more interactive or have flashier graphics or look prettier, you can't just make the argument that that automatically means better. Because look at Jedi Academy. Do I need to keep bringing that game up? Mountain Blade. Is anybody here going to make an argument that those games have shitty gameplay? I don't think so. At least not really rationally. And so it's like they hold up the test of time because combat always holds up the test of time in my. If you can make combat, sorry, let me take that back. If you can make combat hold up to the test of time, you've got a masterpiece of a game. There's perfect examples of this. Half-Life 2, I think, is a good example of this. I think Jedi Academy is a good example. I think, what was another one I was thinking? I mean, Minecraft at this point, right? It has to be old enough to be considered that. No, I actually never, I wasn't prescribing anything to you specifically. Sorry if that triggered you. I used whatever your comment is as a jump off point. And yeah, sorry about Minecraft. Kidding. Or am I? I think you can make an argument that Minecraft's combat's projectile based, right? It's physics based. You have to aim, right? I mean, I'm kind of joking, but I'm kind of like, I mean, Minecraft's kind of, is it really easy to, like, I've watched PvP in it. I'm not saying it's like, oh, a super high skill cap, but the melee combat, I will agree, is atrocious. But I think that can be fixed, and I think Hytale can fix that. I think if you decrease the amount of knockback, for example, like you know, whenever you swing at people, that's one thing that annoys me about Minecraft is there's too much knockback. So I think if there's less of a knockback in Hytale and there's more maybe even a riposte system, a block system or something like that, that could really increase the skill cap in that game, where I am not even kidding when I'm saying, I'm not memeing now. I'm being serious. That version could kick most MMOs ass in terms of combat. Oh, for sure. And guys, remember, I keep telling you, games like Hytale are coming out, and they're gonna make MMOs look silly because they're gonna have all of these creation aspects. They're gonna have 1,000 people servers at some point, and the next thing you know, we're gonna be playing those games instead of playing these other kind of action combat games which look super pretty and sexy. Because although being pretty and sexy is definitely useful, definitely, you know, it's nice to look at. It doesn't keep you playing the game for that much longer. Combat would. The argument I was trying to make earlier about combat being kind of timeless is that it's not timeless. So when it is, it's super special. The fact that combat is one of the first things you notice is like, oh man, this game dated, dude. Like Baldur's Gate, like, oh man, this game's dated. The combat's so old. That's one of the first things you notice. When you play a game that held up that test of time with combat, you're like, man, this game is special. This game did it. You know? And MMOs don't really have a whole lot of games that are like that, except I would argue WoW is one of those games. I trust me, do I think WoW's the best combat system? Not personally. I like other combat systems like Darkfall and Global Agenda, right? Even Age of Conan. I like those kind of combat systems. That being said, why can you make an argument that WoW has a good combat system? Well, functions properly, has a lot of variety, right? A lot of different skills and different types of crowd control. It is packaged nicely. It has class identity in spades, right? That part is pretty easy for the game because it doesn't have a lot of classes, at least like classic WoW does, right? And so you can really, like, when you look at the comparison between a WoW game and a well, I'm more so talking about classics. I don't really play retail, and I never really did play retail. I tried to multiple times, and it just was never for me. I tried Wrath, I tried Carde, and I came back and tried BFA. I you know, maybe I enjoyed some of my time, but I would say I probably didn't enjoy the majority of my time. So yeah, sorry, I'm talking about the classic version. But what I'm saying is like, if you compare the game like WoW to like another combat system, and I'm sure Lemposs has made this argument before. Can you really say that Darkfall has a better combat system if it failed? Like, it's harder to make that argument, right? But that's why if I say like personal preference, I prefer it more. But I also am willing to admit that WoW has a more scalable. Again, to get back to my previous point, when that combat system, the tap target combat system, has started to lose more and more of its variety, and look at WoW. WoW is a perfect example of this. Ability squish they had, like, they've revamped some classes. Some don't even work properly. Like, some trees don't even work properly. It's gotten to the point now where combat in MMOs is such a meme. It's so bad that we don't even know where our like metric is anymore. And that's why, like, look, I don't mean to pick on you Black Desert Online fans. Like, if you like the game, you like the game, man. I'm not going to hold it against you. But it's pretty hard not to just kind of laugh at some of the absurdity that a lot of the people post on my videos about Black Desert Online. They're always telling me about how it's like, it's just so skilled and you just can't comprehend it. And it's like, guys, I played Halo at LAN. Like, you think this is a hard game to me? Like, I played StarCraft 1 for a decade. I even played iCup. You think Black Desert Online is mechanically difficult? It's just kind of like MMO fans don't even know what's considered difficult because we don't have difficult games. We don't have difficult combat systems. And it's like, you think that's difficult? I'm sorry, but like, I'm not trying to make an argument that because it's not difficult, it's automatically bad. I'm just saying my argument always has been with games like Black Desert Online. Don't pretend your shit don't stink. I mean, come on. Like, come on. That game's worse than Vindictus, in my opinion. I think that Vindictus has a better combat system. That's just my opinion. And I think I've made that argument many, many, many times. And that's fair, CHDW. If that's what you feel out of it, if you like the way it's smooth, and you like how, like, you like the more kind of arcadey aspects of it, I have no issue with it. If that's your kind of game, like, all, you know, full steam ahead, essentially. But I just don't like the rhetoric when a fan that likes Black Desert Online then has to go take that to be like, well, because you disagree with me, you don't know how to play this game, or I can't play this, or you can't play this game because it's too skilled for you. And it's like, you guys need some self-awareness. And I'm saying not just to the Black Desert Online fans, but I'm talking about to the other MMO fans out there right now. Like, if you're playing an MMO in current day combat systems, please don't tell people about how difficult your combat system is. Like, who are we kidding, guys? What one of those games is really difficult to play mechanically? Which one? Which one out right now? Elder Scrolls? Invuln dodges? I mean, come on. Invuln dodges in all of those games. None of them are even physics-based. Like, which one is, like, really difficult to play? I'm curious. I think Guild Wars 2 is probably one of the more difficult ones. I do agree with that. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. How about that 1 second? It's more than 1 second GDC, dude. Someone told me it was more than that. Didn't they tell me it was 2.5 or something? Oh, sorry, you're saying you're saying Game Boy Color, Final Fantasy IV on the Game Boy Color. Wow, man. Is that what you were saying? I don't know. Sorry, you said GBC, which is Game Boy Color. I don't know if you were saying GCD. 2.5 seconds, says Rippies. There you go. Certainly hard to master. You get your ass handed to you if you go against someone better than you. I mean, I'm gonna offer a counterpoint in Guild Wars 2. I'm gonna say past a certain point that is the case, Lemposs. But at the top level, everybody's doing it. At the top level, all of the players know what everyone's doing. And it essentially becomes more of a matter of the first person to make the mistake loses. And that's kind of usually what happens in, like, most MMOs at the higher skill level. I would say anything at the higher skill levels, it kind of comes down to, like, small mistakes. But whenever there's less of a skill ceiling, I think it becomes harder to notice the differences. And I think that was a big problem that I noticed in Guild Wars 2 early on, was that why didn't it ever pick up as an esport? Simply speaking, it didn't have the ability to create stars. Like, you hear some people say that and you're like, what does that mean, create a star? To give a good example, does anybody here know who Doublelift is? Probably all of you know who Doublelift is. And it's like, even if you don't play League, you know who Doublelift is. And why is that? It's because League had the ability, the skill ceiling, the mechanics to create a star, right? And Doublelift was a star. And so, like, if your esport can create stars, then it has the ability to create a long-standing esport. Faker's a good example too. Yeah, Brass Monkey's right. Like, Faker's a really great example as well. You say, like, do you guys know who Faker is? It's like a lot of people know who Faker is, even if you didn't play the game. So it's like, I'm just saying that MMOs aren't there yet in terms of like combat ability. The ceiling isn't there yet. We can get there. I'm not saying we can't. In fact, if you want to hear my opinion on it, I absolutely think that MMOs can have the skill level in order to be considered serious as an esport. I do think that. I truly do believe that. And I believe that because I believe it's a special kind of game that relies more heavily on teamwork than, in my opinion, any other kind of game. That's just, again, my MMO biased opinion. Yeah, Shroud's one as well. There you go. Shroud's one from Counter-Strike. You know, a lot of people know Shroud. And it's like, that game created a star. And Guild Wars 2 never created any stars. So, at least not in that PvP realm, right? I mean, maybe there's some YouTubers I don't know about. I don't really follow that scene. What do I think about New World's alpha combat between magic guns and melee? I mean, I think there's been enough public to say that the combat system is, I would probably say, whatever has come out about it, go watch like those videos and you can kind of form your own thoughts. I think it's pretty standard fare survival game. So I guess I don't have any more of an opinion, especially because it is under NDA. So I couldn't talk about it more. Do you think if MMOs tried structured PvP in other ways, like a MOBA mode or something like instead of a BTB, BG, 1v1, 2v2, and 4v4? Yeah, I think the problem with it is that if your game isn't created with enough of a skill level and balanced enough properly, you can really just kind of ruin your game modes overnight. And Wildstar was a perfect example of it. So I played Wildstar at launch. I had a max level character. I alpha tested the game. I closed beta tested the game. I beta tested the game. I played the game at launch. I had a max level character. And then I quit immediately after being a max level character. And I don't know if I've ever told this story, even if I told it in my Wildstar video. But the reason that I quit was, a big reason that I wanted to play that game was they really sold these like big open world PvP zones, which ended up being shit and lagged to hell, and they didn't even work properly. So those never worked, and not enough people could show up for them because they required 40 people. So Arena naturally became like the only thing remaining in that game. The problem with Arena was that essentially what happened is, because there wasn't enough people in the player pool, it kind of didn't have balanced matchmaking. So a lot of the times, and I talk about this in all of my multiplayer shooter video, guys, like seriously, notice this in so many different games and you'll notice how they lose so many players. It's that these games oftentimes don't have ranked modes, and so what starts to happen is the better players play the worst players, Guild Wars 2 for like 2 years, and then what ends up happening is all of the bad players quit. Why? Because they're just getting shit on by the good players. Guys, to give you an example of this, when I used to play Guild Wars 2, and by the way, I played it professionally, so I was pretty good at it. We, in our pre-made group, would play against other random groups who were just put into our tournament bracket. This was before they had constructed tournaments and before they had ranked mode. And so, as you can imagine, we would utterly stomp them because we had been playing since closed beta. We had months of advantage on these people, and we had been playing religiously with microphones in a group against sometimes pug groups or maybe the odd in like casual group every now and then. And in that game, in order to win, it was a 3-point capture system, and you had to get 500 points. We would 500-0 people all the time. And this is not to be like, we're so good. It's like, we lost to top teams too. It's to tell you guys that that's what happens a lot of the times in these games with arena systems and structured PvP, is that there's not enough checks and balances to keep the fucking really good players from just shitting on the bad players. And it's like, do you blame the good players for winning? Like, could you blame us for just being good? I mean, I don't think so. Why is it our fault that we're winning a lot of games? It isn't. It's their fault they didn't put the systems in place to keep us from just, atrophying like the whole audience. And so, like, you have to know how to properly balance that and be ready to do it in a live test environment. That's pretty difficult to do, right? It's really difficult to do that kind of live balancing. And that was another issue in Wildstar, is the game was not balanced. It was not balanced. The sharpshooter, is that what they call it? I can't even remember the damn class. And I had one. I should remember it. But that class was so unbelievably powerful. It was always in every single twos group. It was like the best class in the game, PvP, bar none, because it was so OP and had been OP since the beginning, which is why I was playing it. I like some vanity myself. Do you think the reason why most of the modern MMORPGs are tab target based is because of technical difficulties with the netcode? Sorry if I asked the question several times, but I'm curious what's your answer. Yeah, so I can go into that. In fact, I'll just go ahead and put this as a call-in segment. By the way, you guys remember the MMO Roundtables today. So if anybody is going to have any interest in showing up for that, please join the podcast lobby now. Remember, the topic of the week is, what is a good sandbox system? Like, what's a good system in a sandbox game? Maybe you have an example, maybe crafting in Galaxy, like whatever your example is. If you could join the podcast lobby, that'd be great. If you can't join the podcast lobby and talk about it, just feel free to talk and chat with me. I mean, I always read what you guys say, so if there's not enough people in chat today for me to have a back and forth, then I'll just, I'll create a back and forth with you guys. So just join the podcast lobby for the MMO Roundtable. I'm going to set up for that in just a bit, but to answer your question now that I got that out of the way, I don't think it's netcode. I don't think netcode's the biggest concern. I think it's money. Nearly everything comes back to money. And the reason for that is because, essentially, what reason does a developer have to overbuy servers in order to prepare for a launch? You might ask, well, duh, you're preparing for worst case scenario, bro. You're preparing because you're going to be successful. Well, developers these days, and publishers, I should say these days, don't want to do that. They don't want to prepare for success. They prepare for failure, which is why they keep failing, in my opinion. For example, remember in my Gotham City Imposters video, I pointed out how these games come out with games that are essentially unfinished and then try and monetize. And Gigantic, unfortunately, was an example of that. So many games fall into that trap, and it sucks because they need to make money. I totally get it. But you're creating a problem that essentially is going to consume your own company. Because if you don't have the money, you can't make the content. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, if you don't have the audience, you can't make the money, you can't make the content. So if your game's too early in its development and you launch it too early, it's going to flop. And so it always does come back to money. And so they don't want to prepare for success anymore. They're preparing for failure because they want to maximize profits. And so it's like, that's why they don't have enough servers. That's why WoW doesn't put out an RP PvP server. That's why these different people don't want to put in more server technology. That's why they don't want to evolve combat systems. They don't want to spend the money required. Why do you think that Asian MMOs are so focused on combat? Do you think it's just a coincidence? No, it's because that's where their budget is. It's graphics, it's presentation, and it's the combat. That's what they focus on, because that is what works in their given market. The problem is, though, is that the rest of the game ends up lacking. And that's what I've pointed out so many times about Asian games, is that they end up missing kind of a lot of the MMO aspects, right? There's some exceptions. I'm not going to say all of those games, but there are some exceptions. But that's kind of the thing, is that they're kind of lacking in some other aspects because they end up like putting so much of it into their combat system. My argument is that you can have both. It's just not necessarily going to be easy, and nor is it going to be something that if you don't have the money required to be able to do it, it's going to be something you're going to have to slowly build on. And that's why I like Camelot Unchained's approach of having it more about being like the players are building all of these systems. We're just going to give you really good tools in order to do that. Because then you can have the time to focus on the engine and have the time to focus on ability creation and the combat system and things like that, right? Instead of spending so much time working on things that isn't going to work or that nobody cares about. Like, I'm sorry to beat up on SWTOR a little bit here, and I love the story in that game, by the way, and I've mentioned it, and I've always recommended it to people whenever they ask me about it. But was it worth like 100 mil? I don't know about that, right? I think it kind of was a big reason why that game was not a good MMO. So it's like, from that basis, maybe it wasn't worth it. Because I don't know if it would have cost 100 million to make a single player game. Oh wait, I do know that. It wouldn't have. But yeah, to bring up some examples of combat systems, if you guys haven't already seen them, if you ever get told that combat systems can't be good because they're too expensive or because the server tech just can't hold it, I'm going to tell you guys a couple of examples. So the first example I'll use is Darkfall. So go check out some Darkfall gameplay. Go check out Planetside. Go check out Global Agenda. Go check out any other older Tabula Rasa. Go check out even Asheron's Call. Check out Spellborn Chronicles. These are some different games that have some pretty different and unique combat systems that push the envelope. The problem is that they're kind of all lacking in other ways, right? Like Planetside 2 isn't really an MMO, right? Like it's lacking the kind of more persistent aspects of it. But it's a damn good battle, simulator, if you want to call it that, or warfare simulator. And Darkfall was a fun open world PvP game, but it had a lot of problems with attrition and bugs and glitches and hacking and things like that. So it's like the problem is that when you know what I mean, Lemposs. Anyway, the problem often is that people will look at those games and be like, well, those games failed, therefore equals, like if you're going to work through like the programming language, it's like, it failed, therefore the combat system was the reason. And it's like, that's a quantum leap of logic. You don't know that was the main reason. Like, how could you even imply that? If it's the thing that everybody keeps talking about as being the best part of it, how can you just imply that because it failed, it was the best part of it? You know what I'm saying? Like, why would the best part of the game be the reason it failed? It's very often not the reason, right? Because it's the best thing about the game. It's like people don't say the story in Secret World is why the game failed. It wasn't really why it failed, right? People don't say the combat system in Age of Conan was why it failed. No, it was the lack of content. It was the bugs. It was the glitches. It was Funcom, I should say. How well did Darkfall combat actually work? If someone had a dated internet connection, was it playable? So essentially, in Darkfall, and I wish I could have showed you guys a lot more. It's just like it's one of those games that when it doesn't have the population, it's just not fun to play. It isn't fun to play because it needs that player interaction in order to work properly. And Galaxies is the same way. Like sandbox games they work like that. They don't work well without the right kind of players and enough of those players. So the way Darkfall's combat system worked, and I'll show you guys some gameplay on screen while we're talking about it. All right, so I love showing people this battle. It's pretty good. All right, so this is like a video that comes from 2009. This is when the game was like yet to launch. This is when Darkfall was yet to launch. So just remember, this is 10 years ago that this is the game that was playable. Another thing I'd like to add about Darkfall for people watching right now and realizing how dated this game looks, and it is dated as hell, is the game was already dated when it came out. It had been in development for a number of years. So this game had such a tumultuous like launch cycle and also just development cycle that in a large part it was already so far behind in many different ways. But that's why I love bringing it up as an example, is that it was lacking in other ways, lacking in budget, lacking in dev size, like dev team size, resources, you name it. They had so many problems, and yet they were able to create a game in which the combat system is kind of like Morrowind's. I mean, it's basically Morrowind's combat system, except in this game, there's a parry system. There's also, you do extra damage when you hit people from behind, which I guess, like, you can kind of backstab if you stealth in Morrowind, but not in the same concept of just hitting somebody in the back in this game. So the idea was that in this game, you want to flank people. If you can hit somebody in the back with your sword, you're going to do, I think it was like 40% more damage to them, and that's going to be huge. So you really want to catch people unawares. The reason why you're watching a lot of like projectiles being fired is because these are massive armies. And in battles of massive armies, if you've ever been in a PvP battle with a massive army, you can't just charge melee. Like, that's a huge risk because you don't know if you're going to get wiped. And especially when spells and projectiles and ranged weapons are essentially used in this context in order to kind of bridge the gap, right? So now they're engaged in cavalry and melee combat because the two forces have finally met up with each other after being in ranged combat for long enough. And so now the combat kind of will change, and I'll skip ahead a bit here so you can kind of see whenever he starts to go into melee, if he ever does. This guy does not go into melee, which this is really old gameplay, so I'll chalk it up to him just being bad. But the point being is when you're that close to people, you should be charging melee, because melee does more damage when you hit people in the back than just, you know, shooting them with maybe hitting an AoE on a spell. But then again, back in the days, spells were so OP, they could they could AoE splash people. And as you see here, this is him aiming all of this. He splashed that into the ground and it hit that target. I'm showcasing this to show that look at how old this game is and how little production went into making this game. And yet look at how they were able to create a system in which he could down a player and then gank him, right? And then loot his stuff. And then actually have to fire his abilities at people in order to hit them, including heals. He has to fire heals at somebody if he wants to hit them. And that's just like, that level of physics I've never seen realized in another MMO to this scale before. I mean, this is hundreds of players here. Like, if you look back at the very beginning here, look at how many players this is. And you can't even see the scale because they're not even showing all of the players. Look at that. There's still more players coming. The problem is whenever the game failed to maintain its population, these battles became fewer and far in between. And, you know, with the amount of atrophy that was in the game because of a number of just lack of protections and lack of good systems put into place to keep players from exploiting things, the game became more and more empty. And to give you guys an example of this, this was the Darkfall map. And in the Darkfall map, there was a number of continents. There was the main continent, Aegon, and then there was these 4 different islands. The problem was that in this game, whenever the game relaunched again, even though they learned, you would think that they would have learned from their mistakes the first time. In this map is, I think, if I remember correctly, it's 64 kilometers square, so it's a pretty big size map, if you know that in terms of square feet. It's a pretty huge size map. It's just as big as the majority of the old school games like EverQuest and Asheron's Call and you name it. And so the map was so big, but the problem is it was a mega server, so it kind of only functioned in that way where it was this one big massive server with one big massive landmass. You know, or land masses, I should say. But now imagine that the map is so big that players can barely interact. And now you're starting to see kind of like what caused the death of Darkfall, right? It was essentially like, even if there was players in the game, because the map was so gigantic, ginormous, they hardly could interact with each other. So the solution that I had proposed to the bit of devs that were working on, I guess, the reboots of the game, and both of them, it was a running sim. Exactly, Dead Earth. It was a running sim. Most of the time you spent playing the game, you ran around until you got killed because you weren't paying attention anymore. And that's kind of what happened to the game. And I tried to propose this to the devs, and I always had been steadfast in this point, that if they relaunch the game with all of the landmass, the game will fail all the same. And while I can't necessarily say that that was why it failed, it did fail again. And it is failing. And I think that it's obvious to see, considering I also played the reboots, that it failed for, yet again, the same problem. You have this massive conglomerate of landmass. Boom, this massive amount of landmass. And then you have like, okay, one person. Like, here's a perfect example. You know, I'm going to pull out the paint just to bring up the example here. Come on. Here we go. All right, I'm pulling out the Microsoft Paint. What if every little red dot I'm put here is going to be, let's say, 5 to 10 players, like a small clan. All right, every little dot I'm gonna put is like 5 to 10 players. You guys ready? All right. I'll go off of my memory of how I remember people being on the map. For those who can't watch this live and you're not watching on stream or on YouTube playback, I pulled out a darkfall map and I'm showcasing to people essentially what caused the death of this game, which is, to me, an interesting way for a game to die, but one that essentially, when the game rebooted, they still couldn't learn from their problem, from their mistakes rather, or previous mistakes of the other company, I should say. All right, so I would say maybe one up here, one up here. I'm missing maybe a couple up there. Okay, so I already said right here. Say over here as well. All right, so now you look at this map, and obviously it's pretty hard to see because they already used red on here. But think about this. So I have one here, and I'll use yellow to circle it. I have one here, here, right? So this entire continent has, sorry, this one doesn't count. Oh no, that one did count. This entire little island, which is probably the size of like a lot, this island is probably the size of a good portion of Morrowind's continent. So it's pretty big, right? It's completely its own economy. Ecosystem, meaning it has its own local economy. It has its own specific items that only only drop by certain mobs here. There's rare bosses here. So meaning it's like, it's sustainable on its own. But even on this island, you would essentially have like maybe 20 to 40 players, and they're on this massive island. So how are they ever going to work with each other? They're not going to be able to work with each other. They're never going to interact with each other. They don't have to interact with each other. And so now that's just on an island. Now imagine the massive continent in the middle. And so it worked like this. Boom, you had like some players over here, some players over here, some players over here, some players over here, and then interspersed around here. You're talking about entire like miles of continent in the game, like these lines right here, where you're not even encountering players. You're running like across the entire map and barely encountering players. And so how many times do people want to do that? Not very many times. And so map size, you know, probably doesn't get talked about a lot, but it is pretty damn important. Map size is a reason why your game can fail if it's a sandbox game. So I brought all of this to illustrate that people want to make it like, oh, Darkfall failed because of its combat system. Like, why would you think that in any rational context? And why not, I don't know, it had a tenth of the budget of like EverQuest, or maybe it was made in Greece, a country that basically has no experience making MMOs. Maybe it was because it had this long, you know, horrible like development cycle, right? There's other things that go into it. Sounds like a lot of survival games. Run for a long time, die to someone sitting in a bush or something. And yeah, and the problem in those games is you're talking about full loot, right? Full loot. And that really just raises this. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and move to the roundtable segment of the podcast. This is now the segment in which we discuss collectively as a community whatever the weekly topic is, we agree, we disagree, whatever ends up happening. I'm not going to say we're always going to disagree. Sometimes some of us want to go against the grain. But today's topic, or this week's topic, has just been a simple kind of question, which might be complicated in itself, which is, what is a good system in a sandbox game? Because we talk about systems and tools and things like that, so it's like that's the question is, what's a good system in a sandbox MMO? I want to know from you guys. So feel free now to join me in the Discord. You can join me in the podcast lobby if you have a point that you'd like to bring up. Essentially, the way it's going to work is everybody's going to kind of raise their hand. It's going to be your turn to speak. You speak, say kind of your opinion, bring up your little kind of evidence and your backstory, or explain your reasoning essentially. And then the next person goes, and then at the end, we will kind of talk about whatever we disagree on, maybe hash out more things that we didn't talk about already, and then kind of, end in that way. So this is like just a fun way that we talk about MMOs, but we also talk about them in the context of a community where it's like, it's more about involvement from you guys and not just about only hearing me talk endlessly, because I lose my voice if I have to talk endlessly. Hey, what's up, guys?
Yo.
Good day.
Hello.
Alrighty, so if everybody would just put an X in chat to raise your hand, we can just go in order of everybody putting in an X, and somebody please go before me so I don't have to keep talking. Thanks, Carde. If you go to the MMO Roundtable segment, or section, sorry, in Discord, just put an X in. That way we can have a line formed for whenever it's your turn to answer the question. And if you need a rehash about what the question is, I'll just go ahead and post it in Twitch chat. All right, I'll let Carde go ahead and start the floor off with answering the question.
Well, I'm going to answer it with the very simple yet extraordinarily complex player-driven economy. I think if you want to have a good sandbox game, a cool player-driven economy, like just as much as possible is farmed and produced and used by the players, that I think will be one of the key components and requirements to any good sandbox game, because without it, like, what's really the point?
Okay. I'll go ahead and go next then. Economy is a good one. That's probably one that I would use. But I'll go with one that's like, I would say, similarly related, but I want to be a little bit more specific with it as well. And that's going to be a crafting system. But to be more specific, I want to say a crafting system that doesn't just reward making the same item over and over again, but a crafting system that allows for some level of ingenuity. Like maybe, say for example, in the case of Camelot Unchained, they're going for the idea of having a blueprint. So whenever you create the blueprint, it's your item now. So like when people create that item, it's going to be named your item. So like I like the idea of ownership, more variety in the things that you could create in a crafting system. But essentially the idea is that it goes past being more than just do X amount for this amount of XP. And I think if you can also throw in an extra system into that, say for example, one like a salvaging system or a reverse engineering system, you also make that grind and process that much more enjoyable, since you always make it to where gear is viable or gear is valuable. And I talked about that with Galaxies before as an example, where if I come into Galaxies for the first time as a brand new character and I loot a bunch of items that have stats on them, I don't just throw them away or sell them to the trash vendor. If I want to make money, I reverse engineer them, which allows me to take the mods out of them and use those mods in either to, upgrade other mods, or to end up selling those mods to people and then putting those mods into other pieces of gear that are perhaps better. Yeah, that's my long-winded answer, but I would say a crafting system that allows for some level of ingenuity, some level of ownership, more than just create 1,000 pants. And yeah, that's mine.
I'm next, I think.
Yes, sir.
For me, I think Castle Siege, for me, specifically in open world PvP, was what I found what was really exciting in sandbox MMORPGs. I think it splits up into like 3 parts. Is like the preparing part, and it was really fun to set up your guild and preparing for this massive war that you're going to have with the enemy. Communicating with allies, planning a strategy, what you're going to do, where you're going to place your buildings or defenses, and splitting up your allies or your members into each like specific party names, like defend party and flank party, all that stuff. And then the second part is like in the actual battle and all that. In open world, when things change throughout the battle, and if you lose or win at the end, it doesn't quite matter, but like it's just like really fun end of the day. And at the end, when you have all these guilds flexing on other guilds and like trying to figure out who's the best, I think that in sandbox is what I find really competitive and motivating to like get really strong. I think that's my bit right there.
All right. Well, we had a lot of discussion about it before in the chat, and a lot of the systems people point out I thought could exist really in both sandbox and theme parks, like the multi-class system. Open world PvP for sure could exist in both. So I had to really think what could really only go into a sandbox. Well, the closest I came up with was the skill system in RuneScape, because I would really think freedom to just look at any skill you want. Just pick one of them. You could throw a dart at a board and just go, I want to level that. I want to train that. I want to raise whatever that is. I want to craft that, or whatever you want to do. Just that level of freedom is what I think a sandbox truly needs. That's pretty much my spiel.
Lemposs.
Sorry, mic was off. What I would, or what I find to be one of the best examples of sandbox features is building. Because I think there's a lot gained from building in MMOs, because there's a lot of identity that you can sort of bring out through building, and also because it oftentimes ends up creating servers who can be very different, and it can be almost an adventure to go to different servers and see, well, how did people build here? It's like, did they build the same places? Did they build the same buildings, etc., etc.? That's it. Yeah.
Well, I think that's first off, now feel free, everybody, pitch in whenever you have something to say. We can open up the floor, since now, it's not really something that's like controversial to talk about, because it's not like someone's gonna say a mechanic where, at least I didn't expect anybody to say a mechanic where someone was like, hell no, that's a horrible mechanic. I feel like obviously everything that we mentioned here seems like it's pretty prevalent in most sandbox games. Skill systems, crafting systems, building systems, siege systems or faction systems, whatever you want to call it, and then also just a economy to tie it all in together. I mean, really, if you take all 5 of our ideas, combine them together, you have a pretty good game already, right? So like, I think it's I like to do these kind of exercises to prove to people that you'd surprise yourself. You can come up with some pretty cool ideas. Doesn't mean you can make a good game, but that you can come up like with some pretty good ideas. You got to give yourself some more credit, other than thinking maybe your opinion or your perspective doesn't matter, because I always think it does matter, worth sharing. And I want to go in specifically on what you said, Lemposs, about building. That's kind of where I think that games like Hytale are really gonna shake things up, because I used to think that just building wasn't enough in a game. I really did. That was my opinion before. I was like, building isn't enough in itself. It really isn't. And then like all of these building games started coming out and blowing up, and it was just like, that was my wrong take. I was totally wrong about that. And I think that now you're looking at the future of like, the games who can figure that out are going to be leagues ahead of the other games, because they're going to have repeatable content. It's like greenhouse content, you know. It's always going to be relevant as well. It's not going to be like they can always create more and more. It's not going to be a situation where, oh shit, BFA did bad, now we're fucked.
Well, it does also, well, even though I'm an advocate of the building, it does also sometimes come with certain problems whenever people sort of run out of ideas of what to do and what to build, or if there's not enough land to build on, or if there's certain materials that are rare that you need to build, and suddenly those become outside of your scope of possibility to get your hands on. There are certain issues with the system if it's not completely freeform as well.
Well, I guess that's why people fight for it.
Well, and that's also the thing, but that's where you sort of then also have to create a system where there's at least some level of basis to ensure that you can at least build, I don't know, a tree fort at least to sort of protect yourself.
I think in a lot of cases, and I'm gonna sound kind of like strange, but I think a lot of that stuff fixes itself. Start to take it, I guess, a lot more serious as a world. And a good example of this is you look at, you know, modern day problems or even just past problems with MMOs that have like PvP and things like that, and you think of just like rampant ganking. It's like, oh, you just can't stop these guys from just like killing players, and it's like, well, isn't necessarily true though, because how do they stop murderers in the real world? Like, there's ways they can at least decrease the amount of them, right, that murder. There's ways that they can at least like make it to where if you did do it, you're gonna at least get penalized, so you don't just keep doing it over and over again. The problem in PvP games is like you could just be a murderer and just murder, and you can get away with that, and that's like not really realistic at all.
Yeah, that is one of those things. Some kind of prison system or
consequences as a general topic. That's the, I think, of if you combine the features that we mentioned and you add consequences to it. I think that's one of the other things that could probably really make a game's time.
I know some games have like a karma system of like, if you kill somebody, there are repercussions to yourself, but that might be overtaken by like the benefit of whatever resources you get from killing that person. So it's like a risk versus reward sometimes.
Nerd,
and then if you get corrupted or something, like you get a debuff or whatever, you get sent to jail or whatnot.
Nerd, you can't see it, but I'm grinning ear to ear with that as being one of the biggest advocates for or like a jail system or any judicial system in a game to punish like heavy ganking or any of those systems.
Well, it's because it's like otherwise you're essentially letting the inmates run the prison, right? Like that. Like I look at these games and it's like that's what Darkfall was. It was one of the most toxic communities I've ever been a part of in my life. Like I've never experienced that kind of toxicity where people legitimately would like find your picture, you know, and like things like that's how serious it was. And it in like the vitriol people had for each other. There were like long-standing communities within Darkfall that hated each other, and it was like cool for conflict, but it wasn't cool whenever the game didn't really have the way of like stopping them from doing things like, I don't know, creating another guild just to war deck people and kill them in the city. Like that's the kind of shit that would happen because there was no protections. And the next thing you know, you have like these young new players getting just ran out. Yeah. Next thing you know, all the new players are, and it's like I remember being in clans with new players, and I would try and help and like, hey, you got to learn like this and like try and teach them, and then we would just get zerged by like 40 dudes, and there's no recourse because why not just zerg everybody in a game like that if there's no reason not to? And then you're just like, oh, that's not how the game works all the time. You're trying to like keep like the, you know, the new players excited, and they're like all like discouraged and shit. They lost other stuff and they just got like ran off the, and then we're getting bind camped, and you're like, oh, don't worry, they'll get tired of doing this. And it's like at a certain point, you know, how much more can you take?
I think that there also, again, that it does pose some issues when a developer then, or whenever you sort of give the opportunity to do those restrictions or consequences, because they can also become too much, and then it goes in the opposite direction, where suddenly you don't want a PvP because, I mean, if I PvP, I'm just gonna end up in jail. It's like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm gonna go play a game that does actually allow me to run around circling 24/7.
I think the key there is just, dividing up the territories. Like, that's one of the things, like, in theory, Eve did that really smartly. Like, you have these three major different zones. Like, you got the higher security space where stuff is somewhat, directly penalized. You got the low security space where stuff is like, you're sort of penalized, but it's not directly most of the time. It's not like, oh, you shoot somebody, the NPCs come to kill you. And you got just the 0-0, the wormholes where it's just like, do whatever the fuck you want, nobody cares.
That is a good system.
And the point is, like, it's a good way because it gives people a means of getting in, but you need to make it so that the people in the more secure areas are also not too secure. So because they do need to get introduced into the game, like, yeah, things are dangerous. And it should also be that there's enough incentive for people to get out of there.
Yeah, put
And
higher
that's a
resources.
really, really difficult sort of balance that, I mean, for frankly, Eve never has gotten right in 16 years of its existence. And so that would be a tricky one, I think, to make. But I do think it's probably the best system that I can come up with looking at it.
Well, you sort of usually want to put like more rare and valuable resources in those high risk areas to encourage people to go there to gain that what would you call it, advantage.
Yeah, I don't think it's not just the higher value, because it also that it should be specific. Like, within each of those areas of security, there should also be different areas again, and each area should have their own specific sort of a resource. So there's actually a reason for people to be everywhere. Because that's the
I
problem.
actually thought,
Because the problem like they had in Eve is they put all of the resources actually available in 0-0 space, which is, like, in theory the most dangerous part, but because people can own it, they can secure it relatively well. So it actually has become extremely safe these days. So people have no reason to be either in high or low sec anymore.
I do remember I actually had a thought about that in regards to how to sort of spread out resources. And I do remember one of the things that I came up with was put some of the specific resources, actually put them far into the enemy land, so that you have to have these raiding parties who try and sneak in to the enemy land to get these really rare resources. And it's like posing a large risk and putting you in a vulnerable situation, so that you don't just have these PvP zones where nobody really is the king, only the ones who are the strongest, but also make a system where you actually are supposed to go into the strongest area of the enemy to gain some kind of advantage, or some material to gain some kind of advantage.
I think Leva mentioned it in chat that factions are another way to combat a lot of problems where you're just having like an atrophy, like you're having attrition of players. And I think like that hasn't really been realized yet. Again, you look at Darkfall and there's really none of that. Yeah, there's guilds, but it's like past a certain point, what more does a guild serve other than just like, okay, you're in a guild, you have a place that you can stay, you got a guild bank. Like, what else does it actually? It doesn't actually mean anything more. Then it's kind of like that's part of the problem. If you could create a faction, say for example, you look at Dark Age of Camelot. It's always a good example of creating factions that people actually cared about. And on the same point, when you guys were talking about how to introduce enough safety but also have that still dangerous element, the way that they did it was they had frontiers. So you had like the home area, which is where you just PvE'd basically, but then you also had these frontiers, and the frontiers are almost always going to be contested. So like, I don't mind the idea of contested lands. I just don't like the idea when it's like it's contested, but then it's like you can't actually do anything about it. So it's kind of like the WoW approach, where it's like this is a contested zone, but can you actually like cap the zone? I mean, not in early WoW, you couldn't, right? Not yet. That stuff came out later.
True that. I mean, as in contested zones, and I think again the problem still remains there. Is people need incentive to move into places, because if there's not enough incentive, people will move there, and that's the key bit which you can balance with the resources and as they are needed and requirements and stuff like that. It's always going to be a massive balancing act when you are talking sandbox, because when you give players, MMO gamers especially, if you give them a sandbox, they will manage to find every single flaw in every single rule that you made for that sandbox.
Yeah, I remember that from.
Oh yeah, and then it's like you
Yeah,
can't
in
blame them for doing it. You can't be like, hey, why do you guys keep killing and farming these new players? Well, it's like, well, why not? If that's their
It's
answer,
easy.
it's like, whoops, we didn't design our game right.
Well, the question is also then if you as a community has responsibility to also protect new players.
You cannot rely on the community on that. It doesn't work.
It would be nice if you could. Let's say it like that.
And I've seen some games where like the people be like, "Oh, we got to make the community not gank," and I'm just like, well, if people are ganking each other, it's really just the devs not having a system in place to stop ganking and all that stuff.
Exactly, and that's been a very long-standing argument, which has only recently been resolved within Eve. It's like the whole war deck system in HiSec. Like new players that are like, oh, we're gonna make our own corporation, they would get mercilessly hunted by these few groups of players. They would just war deck everybody and just kill everybody. Like even in the high security space where they were supposed to be reasonably safe, they would really have been more safe in 0-0 space under the protection of one of the big alliance umbrellas than they would have been in HiSec. That shit's pissed off so many people. Like they actually released numbers recently which showed the new player attrition rate, which is like through the fucking roof. It's insane how few players stick around, and that's why it's so important to give those new players that safety that comes from the game and not from the players, because the players are not going to keep it safe. I'm sorry to say it, most players just tend to become assholes.
Well, it's also a big ask to do. It's like, why would you protect them? Like, if there's not really any incentive for you to doing it, or rather, it's such a long-term investment, so to say. That's like, oh, if I spend 200 hours now protecting these guys, then in a year from now we will have 1,000 new people. That's just a goal that's really hard to comprehend and to sort of get into. It's like this is the results of that. So it's hard to get people, the veterans of a game, sort of invested in new players. That's always going to be hard.
Yeah, you're gonna have to make it worth their while, and more than just like, hey, I care, because like you said, that's not enough to do it for a long time. Like consistent. Like for most people, just because you care isn't enough reason to help out new players. There has to be some maybe feudalistic system, some XP share system, some type of system. Maybe for example, like I said, with junk loot or reverse engineering, where it's always useful to farm junk anyway because you need it in order to break it down. So like there has to be ways which those players contribute to things. And hey, it's almost like it goes back to my biggest complaint in most of those games, that not everybody should be a fighter. And I think that solves a lot of those problems, that not everybody should fight. There should be venues or avenues, like Carde was saying, where if people just want to fight, they can just fight. But I think that maybe, while fun on its own right, I think for the player who doesn't really want to fight, they want that whole other aspect of the game that's just sorely lacking. Majority of these games, They don't have the
Like-
farming system, the crafting system, or whatever building system that's going to keep that player playing long term. And since it's like essentially the only thing to do in the game is PvP, that's what they end up doing. And then they just get PK'd and they're like, well, I don't want to do this anymore. Because it's kind of like if you joined a war, but you don't really want to be a soldier. I mean, you're probably not going to be a very good soldier, right? Like, probably don't really want to be there. So it's kind of like, in this case, you know, where we have a draft, but everybody has to join it whenever you play a PvP MMO.
I think one of the big challenges in that is just that it's MMOs. So, and I've said this many a times, they are usually just inferior games in a lot of ways. And creating a system where you have all these other roles that people can play outside of combat is unfortunately just realized in games who do it way better. So it's one of those things where it's hard to connect all the things so it makes sense. It's like, if I'm Farmer Joe, okay, well, what is my interaction with all the warriors, with the masons, with the city builders? It gets a bit tough to make that connection within the game. But it's possible.
I think it's difficult, but again, you just have to think about how do they normally interact anyway. And then like you can kind of build a basis of a game around real life. I mean, like, I don't like realism necessarily in the context of a video game, but you can be informed by real life and be like, well, how does a like you said, how does the farmer normally impact? Well, food. Food is going to be the number one. So it's like, how do you make a food system that's not just going to be, let me create 6 carrot soups or whatever, and then, you know, then you're just like, let me create 6,000 carrot soups and just give them all to my guild. It's like, well, you're not really like a farmer or a chef anymore. You're just like doing the same thing, basically. You know, it's like, it's not enough depth to it to where a chef player is going to be like, wow, this is awesome. I love cooking in this game.
I would say there is somewhat of a problem of equating it or trying to take inspiration from real life because of somebody who grew up in a farming area. Really, the interaction is that you go on your farm and you do the entire season, then you harvest, and then somebody comes around, picks it up, and then some money goes into your bank account, and that's it. That's the interaction that real life really is. But yeah, but I do understand the point. Oh, sorry, Rivers.
No, I was saying it's super deep. One thing I wanted to go back to with the new player experience, though, to touch back on that, was not every new player wants to just have the community come in and go, hey, we need to shelter you. Here's some items to get you started. Here's what you should be learning to do, and here's what you should be training, because that's going to immediately save you. Not everyone wants to just enter a game and then immediately be coddled. It's probably one of the only things I see that happens in Eve that I question like the heaviest. Because if you're a new player in Eve, even if you're a free-to-play account, if you join a corporation, they will say, here's a skill list to go start training. Here's some basic ships to go around in. Just occasionally do stuff with us. But you're immediately coddled with it.
I mean, I sort of understand where you're going from, but I think considering like if you've taken Eve as an example, and as I said, they released the numbers on new player retention, it's clearly that most people need more of that because a lot more players are leaving. Like, of course, there will always be players that want to figure things out on themselves, and there will be groups that are supportive to that as well. But yeah, in case if you're gonna join people, you know, especially in a sandbox game that are PvP oriented, they're gonna be like, you know, if you're a new player, they're gonna be like, okay, you're welcome, but we need you to follow these and these steps because we need you to be effective within our organization. And at that point, it's a choice for a player to make. Do I want that? Yes or no?
I
Well,
think that's an
most
okay
players
decision to
take it.
make. Oh, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go.
I was just going to say, I think that's an okay decision to make as long as you can also choose something else. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, if you can be like, hey, I want to join, because what you just described to me sounds like when you join the military. Give you some gear, place to stay, a little idea, and it's like, all right, there you go, which is okay. But not everybody wants to join the military. And that goes back to my whole argument about, like, Farmer Joe needs a place in this game, all right? Farmer Joe, man. Let's get some support for Farmer Joe. And
There's that one
MMOs.
guy who wants to chop trees all day. There's the one guy who's really willing to grow cotton all day. There's always those people, and they're gonna be thrown in the environment and just go, "Wait, this game's only about me running in the front line as a Zerg? What am I doing?"
And that's, I mean, basically, I saw it all the time in Darkfall. People would tell me, hey, man, I suck at this game, but I want to be useful. What can I do? And it would be hard for me to tell them anything because it's like the game had a problem of too much of a skill cap in the sense that we're like, all the best players play together and shit on everybody else. So it's kind of hard for me to be like, well, just practice. Because it's like, that basically means he's going to have to get shit on in order to learn. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, you have to give somebody the other option of being like, you know what, I got shit on for like 20 minutes today, or for an hour today in PvP. Let me go do something else now. But if that's the only thing you're doing, it's just like, I'm going to log off now.
You know, it's actually one of those things that I came to think about when it came to something like Planetside 2 and other sort of big, large-scale military sims, is oftentimes something like logistics. Because that's something that Planetside 2, for example, sort of lacked. And it was actually one of those things that we oftentimes sort of contribute to being somewhat of its downfall, was that you just had the front line. There was no logistics. There was nobody behind your lines that you really had to care about. And it made combat very just face on face. But really, when it comes to military simulators, you usually want it to actually be these long, spread out throughout the front fights, where there's a lot of different weak points to sort of care
Objectives.
Amen to
or
that, yeah.
objectives, yeah.
I know this is a little contrarian, but at one point, Planetside 2 did have some logistics to it when it was your infantry resource, your aircraft resource, and your vehicle resource. But then they all combined that into one resource, and the resource line stopped mattering. And that
I mean, it
was
never
terrible.
mattered. I'm sorry.
That was also a rubbish system.
Yeah, it could have been better. Like, that could have been an actual logistics system, but they never
Well,
went through it.
I think I can recall one time, and I played it for quite a few years. I can recall one time that we were like, yeah, we're out of fucking resources. And that was when we were on our last base on Indar. And I was in command that day. That's why I still remember that. And we're fighting a combined assault from both the Terran and the VS against the NC there. That was the only time, like, when you see a single tank, it was like, holy shit, thank you, thank you, thank you. But that's the only time I've ever felt in that game like, yeah, your resources matter. But I fully agree with Lemposs. Like, a logistics train that to supply a war effort would be really nice, because that's actually something you don't even have in Eve. Like, there's logistics in moving your ships around, but it's not like
It's like logistics comes from out of game, right? Wouldn't you say?
yeah,
What?
mostly it's a lot of out of game in Eve.
Oh,
But it's, yeah, I think adding logistics to making it a real requirement, so making it so, like, yeah, you can only have so much with you in your sandbox game anywhere you're going on campaign, that you need those logistics train, which actually means that if a larger group attacks a smaller group, the smaller group can still win by simply waging
Attrition.
harassing war on those logistics convoys. At which point the larger group will at some point be like, either they're running out of resources, or they're just going to be like, shit, this is costing us way too much to even bother with this attack, and they'll just pull out.
it was something that was in Planetside 1. You had
I think
who had to supply bases through driving trucks to each base to give them points that you could use to spawn the different, or not different classes, but at least max units, and also units which had, I think it was 100% inventory, and if not, you only had 50, which was quite a lot of, or quite a detriment to have, because suddenly you only have a gun and like 2 magazines to handle with. And same thing with tanks and aircraft, and suddenly you are fighting against a way better armed enemy.
I think Planetside 2 tried to do that with like the base building system that they had, and how they had the ant vehicles trying to collect nanite resources from nodes across the map. But nobody really wanted to do it because it was like it cost a lot, and building bases was like it wasn't that fun to do. So gathering resources never really took place.
The biggest issue was that they built that system upon the already existing game, which had bases basically everywhere, and suddenly they come in and say, yeah, you can build your own bases with no purpose. I mean,
And
oftentimes
everybody was like, who cares?
It was like adding another game on top of the game. but it just
essentially,
didn't-
I mean, there was like I think 5 or 6 spots on each continent where building a base was somewhat advantageous, but that was it. And sometimes you could build that base, and for like the next 24, 48 hours, the enemy wouldn't even push far enough into your territory where that base actually mattered. So it's like, it's not that helpful.
I think it would have been an interesting system if it had indeed been put in like, this is a new continent, it's not established, and these are just like the hex tiles, build bases on them, claim those hex tiles, and move from there. If there were no existing bases at all, then it could have been interesting.
I think
it would have been good if it enhanced the ready bases that are already there, and like the walls, and you could like reinforce the bases already there with like walls and stopping tanks coming in and stuff like that.
The problem is how the map generally works in Planetside 2, because there's a lot of bases where if you can just add a single wall, you've basically won.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Like, a lot of those bases are not made. Well, the problem is the game is not made to have the ladder system which connects all the bases. Like, it wasn't built like that, and that became a real big issue, because suddenly there's these really small bases and you can only go in one direction, so suddenly you have 200-300 people fighting in this teeny tiny base, and it's like capturing a point and holding it for 5 minutes when the enemy can spawn 100 people who can just run straight in and just need to take back the point.
I remember that as well. That was my
the
last
max
experience playing the game.
were so annoying. Like, I mean, that game, I will say it was really fun for a while, but it was so fucking broken.
I think it lacks longevity for a number of reasons. That kind of randomly enough makes me want to then ask the question, and maybe we can make it another discussion, but since we had so much good discussion about it, but how do you fix Planetside 2? How do you make that into a working MMO? Is it possible, or is it just like there's no way past that?
Oh, it's possible.
It's very possible.
Okay.
Essentially,
And you guys sound excited to talk about it.
Well, essentially, you take the original idea, which was you have the continent and you have a certain amount of bases. First of all, you delete a lot of the bases because you don't need them. Second of all, you will remove the lattice system so that all bases are capturable, but there should be penalties for if it's not on the front line. So if you try and capture a base way into the enemy territory, it's going to take a very, very long time so that they have time to respond. Because the way it sort of functions is that you don't really notice if somebody is capturing something in the corner of your bases or of your part of the continent. But if it's on the front line, which you always have the eyes peeked on, then it's possible. Then you implement the before mentioned logistics system to ensure that there needs to be a constant stream of resources to maintain the combat, which then results in the enemy having a possibility, even as in small numbers, to hamper your capability of either defending or attacking by attacking the logistics. It also and is when it comes to the logistics, it actually gives a really, really good role to the Air Force, because they always sort of lag in, and that's true for almost all shooters which has aircrafts in them, is that they either end up being these really strong killing machines that can just absolutely delete everything, or they end up being wet noodles who sort of just, they shoot a little, they kill a couple of people, then somebody finally pulls AA and they just fly away.
I think it's the key there is indeed remove a lot of bases. I would say add in buildable stuff for yourself and the logistics, but I would go as far as saying, like, make the logistics count for everything. Like, You can even make it so in a game like Planetside 2, make it so that you actually have your ammunition, and your ammunition supply is part of those logistics, even for your infantry weapons. Because that would suddenly make it also a interesting thing versus a skilled group of smaller players versus a larger group of players, who tend to be less skilled. That smaller group of players can be a lot more effective per resource spent than that large group of player can be, which would actually counter in a way this whole zerking mentality, which has also really been a large detriment to a game like Planetside 2. You want to make the encounters, mean something and not be like, if you are indeed a good group of people, that you're just getting overwhelmed every single time you show up somewhere. Because the
I
max.
mean, even against Zergs, you could do a lot. I mean, we did that against Trident, which was the biggest Vanu sovereignty outfit there was. Essentially, what we would just always do was wait, not Trident. Doesn't matter. We would essentially just always circumvent them and shoot all their spawnings under us. We never really won against. We never really won against them. We just hampered them so much that they got so annoyed that they would actually pull back to try and kill us. We were that much of an annoyance.
They don't have to win the somewhat battle. Lucky still, because like when we were fighting on our top, like at some point most of us just started to get worn out, simply by the fact that we would show up with. If we showed up with a squad, they would drop a platoon of maxes on us. If we showed up with a platoon, they would drop 3 platoons of maxes on us. It was literally arriving at a base, and within 5 minutes that would happen. Every single time.
Strong response time.
I also think
they have good response times, but it's like the 3-2-1, it was never fun. And as you said, because the logistics is missing, there was no reason in there. And having another thing I would say, like, okay, a game like Planetside, we have these 3 arbitrary factions. Could we actually make it so that we would make it larger and people could just move out and create their own factions?
I doubt that. I really doubt that, because simply because it's a shooter, and yes, people can be good at shooters, but you end up with the problem with mega guilds or mega outfits in that case that just dominate, and being small outfits, well, you can hold a base maybe. That's it. If you ever try and move out, they'll just respond in big. So no, I do think there needs to be set factions, so there is quite a good amount of balance between them.
So as I was saying, I think win conditions also need to be reworked in Planetside 2, because I don't think the win conditions and when you actually do win, the benefits you do get from it is that great. And it never really felt good to like win a map. It also kind of felt sad because the battle's ended, It's not like, oh man, I won, I got these benefits, that I can like do better with these benefits. Or if you lost, it's like, oh no, I can't do these certain things. So it's just like, oh, the battle's gone, on to the next map. And the winning conditions just didn't feel that good. And also the ability to win, just getting these points objectives and these alerts weren't that good. I know they're working on it. I don't know what changes they made to it recently. Before it was just you just 2v1 each faction, or you just stay really down low and then just get all the bases to like get maximum points and just win the game. But if you win, then battle's over and nothing happens.
The old alert system was actually quite good, because that was before Lattice existed. So, for example, when you had to take tech plants, you didn't just want to take the tech plant, you actually also wanted to take all the bases that were surrounding it, so that you had this staging point if it ever got taken back, or if the enemy dropped entire platoons on it. Well, you still had 6 bases right around it that you could spawn at and just win through attrition, because they couldn't really do a whole lot against that. So that actually had a lot of purpose. It's the newer ones that are a bit worse, actually, just winning the continent. In regards to winning and it not meaning a whole lot, I think the problem is giving you anything, which it actually does. It does give bonuses to, or it gives
Yeah,
what is it?
decrease in
Discounts.
nanite costs
Yeah.
for like air vehicles and stuff like that.
Yeah, which it's not that bad right now because back when I at least played, it wasn't that bad because oftentimes there was a limit on how much vehicles, for example, were capable of. But if we talked about more open system and suddenly you give a 50% discount to main battle tanks, you're screwed because they can pop them out at twice the amount of time or twice the amount that you can, and they can just throw them in there. They're going to win. That's just how that is. So it doesn't matter how good you are.
That again does also depend on which continent and which bases you're fighting on. Like, there are plenty of bases in the game that are like you can put 100 tanks outside there and they're gonna be utterly and completely useless.
Yeah.
Like, they're not gonna be able to do anything. And then there are other bases where the continuous tank spam just means that the defenders can't do anything because outside of their doors is a continuous barrage of high explosive.
Hey,
So
man.
as soon as you walk out, you're dead. But I think that's come down to, that's, I think, basic map design and basic thing, level design that they should work on that point. But I think if you really want to make it work, remove a lot of the bases. Like, probably most things that are like not tech plants and things like that, like keep those kind of bases, and in between allow people to build their own bases and have those logistics trains and let everything matter. Like, if you need C4, it will cost logistics points. If you need to reload your ammo, it will cost you logistics points. And it will force that entire, that more dedicated push, that more, okay, we need to go there. And then, yeah, you will have these larger Zergear groups that are going to be very useful in certain things. And you're going to have more specialized sort of, player organizations pop up that, some people will specialize in providing air support. Some will specialize in, doing those logistics trains. Some will specialize in disturbing enemy logistics chains. Then you will start to feel more like an MMO. And then also, I would say you have to probably somewhat slow down the capturing of a certain continent. So, like, maybe it does take quite a while to capture content, which makes it feel like so much more. Like, if it takes your faction maybe a couple of days or maybe even a week to finally capture that continent, it feels far more like an achievement than it's like, oh yeah, we captured Indor again. Didn't we do it this morning? Yeah, we did it this morning as well.
Yeah, I was about to say that too. It feels longer to capture the continent.
The problem with that is that it's a 24/7 game. And even in the extreme, say you play 8 hours, there's still 16 hours of gameplay that you don't have.
That's what I find very difficult about it, Lemposs.
Yeah,
but
that's the problem. It's not real war. So,
but it's still an MMO always goes on. Like, a game like Eve doesn't stop either. So I don't see the point there.
But people go back and collect resources and grind for the next battle. But like, I think Planetside 2 is a continuous battle. And that's the difference.
No, what I'm trying to say is that, yeah, it might be nice to have it last longer. The problem is you don't have the control in all the time that the game goes on. So you might have a plan on how to capture the continent, even over an entire week. But if you're just third of that, and you're
falling away.
Yeah, you cut off there. Must be lagging.
Don't have the same plans, that's going to overlap quite a lot, and that's going to be very problematic.
Lemposs, you have to restart that one because you fell away for a large portion.
Oh, come on. Okay, so what I said is that since you're only in command about 1/3 of the time, the ones who are in command the other 2/3 of the time might not have the same idea how to capture a continent. And that's very problematic because if those plans don't come together, then you have a large problem because suddenly you might be focusing in one area, and they then elect to focus in another area, and you constantly keep winning and losing these two areas, so you never get anywhere.
I have an
That's-
idea.
I'm
in that
going
sense.
to
the big problem
disagree.
there.
I have an idea.
I'm going
there.
to strongly disagree there.
I'll let you
'cause
disagree first,
I
and I'll tell
think-
you guys my idea.
Yeah. Because looking at, I know, I'm sorry I'm bringing, I look at EVE up, like campaigns in EVE can last freaking weeks and months, and they don't have an issue with doing it over all the time zones. Like, the EVE servers are down for 15 minutes each day. All of the other time, shit can go on. So, like, if you really want to, and people are like, oh, this isn't working, at some point people will join up and work together to be like, okay, what do we think about this? Okay, let's go and try that. Let's go and do this, see if that works. It actually, forces people to work together and play together far more. So I would see that more as a positive than a negative.
But that's the problem, Carde. You're talking about EVE, which is guilds, not factions. This is factions. I don't have the same coherent plan, and I don't have the same coherent control over all the other
that's a good
outfits
point.
within my faction. I can't
But
go
the
tell
outfits
TTRO that we're going to attack the southern part if they want to attack the northern part.
I mean, I don't know how it was on the you were, but we were communicating a lot with a lot of the different outfits within our faction. Like, I think most of the big outfits that we had, that we were all communicating in one, at least in some way, with each other to see like what are our plans.
Yeah. Now do that on a weekly basis.
Yeah,
and come
that's
to a consistent
that's
basis.
kind of my point is how sustainable is it? I would always come back to that whenever I would think about Planetside 2. To jump in and mention something, and by the way, just so everybody knows, we're reaching the end of the podcast just in general, so it's been some great discussion. Somebody in chat brought up a really good idea, and I want to ask you guys now. What if we did a weekly topic, but we also did a weekly save this game? I feel like we already have people here. Why not just talk about a game and how we could fix it? I like the idea of going through Planetside 2 and thinking, and we just got lucky that we have Planetside 2 vets in the chat, but I'm just saying, like, imagine we come in with the idea of like, hey, if you want to talk about this game and what you could do maybe to make it different now, or what you could have done back then differently, it's a fun idea to explore. But to jump into the Planetside 2 discussion a little bit, the thing that I would like to see in the game, which I think kind of goes along with what I was hearing from Lemposs, is like logistical side. If you have a macro board, maybe that could somehow at least allow for some level of macro play without having to be there 24/7. So like you could say, okay, we're gonna make a decision to go attack this place, and then maybe it actually moves you there, and I know Planetside doesn't work like that now, but just hear me out. You move to this given area, and then now that is the area in which you can choose to fight in. And so it's still kind of instance in the same way, right? It's this perpetual battle, but it's a perpetual battle in which, kind of like in Global Agenda, if you remember that game, you can choose to attack another alliance. So it's like you could make it at least have some level of macro ability, and I think that would greatly increase how the game plays out in terms of its like strategic aspects.
That would certainly be interesting. But I think
was
Rippers
thinking-
want to say something.
Yeah, I was thinking about the logistics system, and the only problem I really see with it is Planetside 2 has to accompany even the random person. You have to have that group of people who just public join a platoon and they're going into whatever battle they can. So your logistics system has to somehow accompany them, but outfits are going to sit there and go, we want a logistics system for our outfit because we know that there's going to be those 4 squads that are going there, and we know there's going to be another platoon going there, and we want to make sure they keep getting their tanks, they keep getting their aircraft, and they keep getting their ammo. They don't really care to fuel the random public player who's just going to randomly keep spawning their max or keep spawning a tank because they think it's going to work that next time, and they're wasting the resources.
Yeah, that is one of those issues.
But what if
And that
you
is
made
actually
it
hard
based
to
on
address.
ranks? And I know that's a little bit elitist, but what do you think of that, Lemposs? Like if you put it about ranks, that you have to be a certain rank in order to affect how logistics gets formed or moved around. And I know that I'm sure there'll be some level of elitist there, but
No, it is actually something that I have thought about, and I think the best solution is to somewhat lock it down so that, for example, if you as an outfit or just as a platoon of randoms, you can sort of lock it down to say that, okay, the logistics that we bring in can only be used by either our outfit or squad or platoon, or it can be used by all platoons around, etc., etc. I mean, it is one of those things, and I will say it's a perpetual problem in a lot of military sims. Is that if you're not in a group, the game is just really hard to compensate for you. And I mean, in Planetside defense, they're probably the ones who did it the best.
I was
I
actually
haven't
going to
really
say that
seen
as
anyone
well.
do it better.
I was going to say that that's actually the thing that I think Planetside did the best, was letting the random Joe actually feel like he's part of the battle. But at the same time, in a weird way, by letting it easy for the average Joe to feel part of the battle, they let like the OGs who really care about it kind of by the wayside, in a sense, where you have to focus more, like you have to focus with your game as well as like adding content. You have to focus on deepening the pool, and like Raf Koster talks about that a lot. But if you're not continuing to deepen the pool like Path of Exile does, then people are just going to get bored of it eventually. And I think that Planetside is an example of that, where the other end of the spectrum, maybe the more hardcore end of the spectrum, could have used a little bit more love. Because I mean, frankly speaking, that's, in my opinion, that's the audience that's still playing the game mostly. From what I've seen, is a lot of like very loyal fans who still play that game. And I feel like maybe that could have been a better idea for them. But I understand the idea of focusing on the young, you know, random soldier guy who just comes in and fucks shit up and then leaves, except for the fact that after a while, what if that guy doesn't come in anymore? And then it's like, well, then the other guys are just going to leave.
I mean, to be honest, I think a game like Planetside, as a random person, and you're not going to join a group, I think you're going to get bored really quickly.
But at least that's an option, though. It's kind of my argument. Is like, I still want it in my like make-believe sandbox game. If I want to have like farmers and like a cook and like all these different roles, I still want to make it accessible for people who just want to show up and just blow shit up. But I'm not going to say that that's going to work effectively, which I think is kind of maybe what you're kind of saying in like in Planetside's context, is like, if you play alone, I mean, even if you're good, you're like, your ability to affect the outcome is not going to be as much as if you're playing with a group. That's just a fact.
Yeah, definitely. It's like when I came in with the roundtable, it was skills. You have the ability to come in, you point at what you want to do, and you can start doing it. Now, granted, I never like specified, sure, you're not going to be the best at it. You don't have people funneling resources to help you get it. You don't have help. You're not helping out a big cause, so you might not be efficient at it. But that should be an option. You should be able to always enter the game and go, I want to do this. I'll run logistics for some random outfit. I don't care. I'll farm. I'll go get nanite, I guess.
And Leave has been saying it in chat, but if you guys have experienced that Foxhole game or watched any gameplay on it, they have a logistical system in it.
Yeah, and it's not the best. I'll say that much. It's not amazing, but it's not bad either.
But at least it introduces the playstyle of maybe someone who's playing behind the... Like, I think that needs to happen. And it's kind of like what I miss about early Dark Age of Camelot, was like a scout or a spy was very important. You needed somebody to see when the big army was coming, because, I mean, when big armies collide, right, it creates this big battle. So it's like you needed to kind of keep away from each other. You would have scouts who would, you know, see people and things like that. But it's like a lot of those things, I think, stop existing whenever we just keep going back to the tried and true tri-realm PvP. Hey, you know, big instance, and it's just like, I think we can kind of, at this point, show that maybe it's time to move past that like basic idea. Because I mean, at this point, I'm not convinced it has any longevity. Can anyone show me an example of it having a lot of longevity? Like the typical 3-faction in current day MMOs, it's like, I mean, nobody cares about it. No one cares about the factions.
No, I think that's to bring it back. To bring it back to you, to the sandboxes. And I think that's, you know, one of the strong appeals of the sandbox game. Like, there are, in essence, like, you don't need factions, and people can just create their own and create something that they actually care about.
Where I think that sandbox games are lacking, and I think I can kind of end this on this because we're reaching kind of the end of the podcast already, and I wanted to get in some call-in or questions in before I say goodbye to everybody. So first, I want to thank all of you guys for stopping by today and joining me in this discussion. It's been a fun one. But before I forget, and I'm already forgetting what did you say before then, Carde?
Sorry?
What did you end with? Sorry, you made a point and I was gonna follow up on it and then I totally forgot what you said.
I said as with sandboxes, like you don't need traditional factions, so players can, create their own and
Right.
have something they actually care about.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's where I think we can actually learn from theme park games. And I'm gonna sound like kind of crazy in here for a second, but hear me out. So like, you know how in theme park games like WoW, for example, you have a reputation system. What if I told you that a reputation system is genius? It's fucking genius. It is genius. Even in a sandbox game, it's genius. But a lot of sandbox games don't do it because they skimp on NPCs and they skimp on NPC factions. And so what if you had NPC factions that could be involved with, or you could involve with, or you could impact the way that they maybe grow, the way that they affect the world by your reputation with. So say, for example, if a certain node is uncapped and you decide that you're going to cap it in the name of X faction, well, that creates a place of operations for that given faction, even if it's just like they spawn NPCs on a basic level, which has been done already with like Tabula Rasa. But like that allows you to connect the aspect of the game itself with the players and their idea of creating factions. I think that's kind of what happens in a lot of sandbox games is the lack of NPCs means that the world doesn't really feel like a world. It just feels like a vessel for the players. And it also has to feel like a world, which some theme park games weirdly will do quite well, right? Especially with the new player experiences.
Thought you were going to go in a different direction with that one. But I guess it's more of with WoW, I guess it's more of a product of its time. But I feel like it did factions really well, at least in Vanilla and Burning Crusade. Because when people played, how you only can have one faction on a server. If you made an alliance character, you can only make an alliance character from then on that server, unless you deleted all of them. And that really formed the true tribalism of like for the Horde or for the Alliance. People really fell into those categories. And even though there wasn't like a lot of identity really to those factions beyond like what was created with the Warcraft games and really just identifying, oh, we have Thrall and Orgrimmar, we have Varian, or I think it was Bolvar at the time, and Stormwind. You made these factions and people felt like they were part of them, even though it's a theme park game. There wasn't much that you were actually influencing on those factions.
Yep, and that's exactly kind of my biggest issue with it, is actually the thing that, weirdly enough, as you mentioned, kind of carried it by, which is this whole like tribalism of the two different factions. And that's why like when we have our WoW Classic guild, we have to make our own content, as Lemposs kept, stressing earlier. It's like if you don't put the onus on the community, then you are kind of to blame in a way. And so it's like, I'm not going to say that we are to blame for the fact that they didn't increase the depth of their systems in regards to the warfare between the two factions. Obviously, that I disagree with that, but I do think at this point with WoW Classic, we know what it is. We know what it's lacking. And so we have to essentially make up for that lacking. But I will say that that's kind of why over the years, I used to really favor a faction system, funny enough, just like a typical 1, 2, 3 faction system. Because it was like, it's simple and it's like not as difficult to mess up. Or it's not so difficult that you mess it up in the sense of like, Darkfall or Eve having more kind of open-ended guild, or I mean, I know Eve also has factions, but Darkfall definitely did. I think that having some kind of faction system that's like more has more depth and more variety than just like I'm a horde and I'm an alliance, and it's like that's kind of where it stands, and that can be fun and enjoyable. But what if I could tell you something like I'm horde, but I'm undead, or sorry, forsaken. So maybe I'm not really aligned with the horde in the same way. And so maybe we work together, but faction-wise, we're actually separate. And so sometimes we actually decide to help the alliance instead. Or, you know what I'm saying? Just some level of nuance introduced into that situation increases the amount of replayability and the amount of ways that you could play the game in terms of like factions, like much differently. Besides it just being like, hey, everyone's in my same faction. And also, to get this out of the way before I end the podcast, the joke that I would make in that specific regard is that at that point, whenever you have whenever you're working with like, let's say the horde faction, right? And what if you guys ever played a game where you have like one or two factions, or sorry, 2 or 3 factions, and 1 or 2 of the clans in your faction you can't stand, or you dislike, or is even just like, you know, vitriol, like you hate them? That happens all the time, and it's like, what can you actually do? Like, let's say your horde buddies show up and they totally blow the spot and then ruin some given like PvP fight because of, I don't know, whatever ends up happening. Hear me out. And you're like, man, I don't want to work with those guys anymore. But you don't have a choice, dude. They're in your faction, whether you like it or not. There's no nuance. There's no, I'm going to kick these guys out of my faction. There's no, hey, screw these guys, I'm not going to work with them. It's just like, I have to work with you. And for me personally, that's kind of the thing that annoys me the most, is that even if my teammates are like, hey, fuck you, dude, I kind of don't really have a choice but to work with them. I can't just kill them and steal all their shit, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I remember that in Planetside. Our outfit, I don't remember what the other outfit's name was, but we had to work together with them so many times. And because how the outfits were laid out, their outfit was actually above ours, so they had better, they always gave the orders. Our outfit hated them so much because anytime we would get on, they would already be playing, and they'd just go, yeah, just start doing this. And we just hate it. We were pissed the whole time because we kept following their orders, because the other outfits were like, yeah, we really need you to do that. So we were kind of like throttled into that area anyway.
I mean, that is part of being in a community. Sometimes you have to deal with not getting to do exactly what you want always for the betterment of the whole.
I think going forward in the future, the best way forward is an open-ended faction system, just because it's going to increase the amount of content in your game just like tenfold. By having such a system, you're going to have more content than you would otherwise, unless you're willing to do what WoW did, which was revolutionary at the time, which was, we're going to create a bunch of tailor-made content for these factions, which works up until it doesn't, because it's like, after a while, if they're not going to keep deepening that and making it more complex, or adding a lot more story content, or people are going to like the story content, then they're going to run into that same problem of, okay, now what? So how do we fix this issue? If all of a sudden the developers are just like, hey, we're not going to do anything now, they're kind of screwed. It's going to have a shelf life. Whereas if it's an open-ended faction system, there's a lot more chances that it can keep going, right? It's going to have some more level of playability. But all right, I think we've reached the end of of the podcast, I'm safe to say, or at least the end of the roundtable segment. I'll give you guys a couple more minutes to ask some questions in chat. So I'd like to thank everybody in the lobby right now for stopping by and chatting with me and chatting with us on the podcast today. I'll see you guys later. Thank you.
Welcome.
See you around.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, so that was awesome. We had another good roundtable, and I think we're going to go forward with that idea of maybe each week we can also throw in another question. We can have like maybe a question like, hey, what's your favorite sandbox feature? And we answer that, but then we also say, how would you fix Warhammer Online? Or whatever game on our series, we could just pick one and be like, how would you fix that game? And who knows? I mean, maybe that could end up being a regular thing that I think we would really enjoy. Because I think we could always play with the ideas of like, what if? You know, it's fun to think about that sometimes. Since there ain't a whole lot of other MMOs out there that we can crush about at the moment, at least not me, and most of the people who follow me. Why not get some more talks in, stuff like that? I have a whole list of stuff on how to fix ESO. I would rather just start from scratch, I'll be honest. I'll be completely honest. I'd rather just start from scratch with that. That's my opinion, but you guys don't want to, or do you want to hear me rant more about that? If you guys have any questions you'd like to at me in chat or ask me in chat about, I'm about to head off now. I've had a great podcast with you guys so far, and I appreciate everybody watching and pitching in and being active. That's always good to see. I always say to you guys, if you don't have money, I don't expect you guys to give me. But what I expect, if you like watching my content, that you'll support me. So it's like, you don't have to give me money, just support me. Just talk in my chat, just talk to me, ask me questions, like my videos, there's so many different ways that you can help and be beneficial to me as a content creator without just having to give. So don't feel bad if you can't like sub to me or whatever else. Just be in chat, be active, and be contributing. And that also matters. What about specific features of an MMORPG that you would fix rather than the whole game? I mean, that's another video in itself, man. Another video in itself. Every hole is a goal. 69. Great name, by the way. I would probably have to say community interaction, and to be more specific, since people just kind of say that word, I mean more abilities in order to impact and affect my environment, first off. More ways in which to have persistence, like player housing and crafting systems and things like that. More ways, as I mentioned earlier, to tie in the world to the player base. So I mean ways in which you affect maybe certain factions, maybe you can affect the way that a certain town is raised. Maybe you could even say, for example, if you support a town and you support its node, if you will, maybe that town is thriving now. Maybe it changes the way the town looks. Maybe people add buildings to that town. Some sort of kind of like new real estate feature. There's so many ideas, but it's not just about ideas. It's also about taking those ideas and battle testing them. So you need to test ideas. You need that back and forth. And so if I bring up an idea like this, and I was like, let's say the king or the head of development for whatever big agency, studio, you name it, corporation. And I was like, hey, here's my idea. If nobody pushes back on me, then maybe I just go with my first idea, which, by the way, your first idea is nearly never good enough. And that's kind of the problem, is early MMOs were a lot of people's first ideas. So it's kind of like there's no way for them not to make mistakes, especially when there's no precedent and when it's essentially a thing that's never been done before. Scale of such a game of an MMO. So what I'm trying to stress is that good ideas don't make good games. Good games make good games. Now, can a good idea be a central reason why a game is good? Absolutely. But what I'm saying is that a good idea in itself doesn't make a good game, because many games have great ideas and not good. So it's like you do also need to have some level of back and forth between people, test your ideas. And then, in the case of a developer, you need to actually be able to see and wonder, how can I put this system in my game? So how is this going to look under my engine, under my framework, my coding, whatever else, right? And that's when you can kind of come to the realization of how realistic it's going to be in order to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. Why do I think that Final Fantasy XIV is so popular? I kind of mentioned this last time, but I think it's a mixture of competition is lacking. The Final Fantasy brand and Square Enix as a company is the biggest companies there is, especially in the realm of gaming. I will also say that it's got a simple but effective job system that allows people to have a bunch of variety in the way that they play the game. It has a story mode for the people who maybe are more interested in playing MMOs like their single player games, which I'm sorry, that's usually what story modes are about. And it also has a number of raids and in-game PvE systems, which for people at the moment right now is still highly sought after, especially because, like, again, it's competition. So it's like, what's the best on the market right now? People maybe who play that game are going to argue it's their game, right? Whereas people who play ESO are going to say it's their game. And people like who play WoW are going to say it's their game, even though they're pretty damn similar, especially in their end result. What MMO am I most excited for? Ooh, that's a good one. You know what? At the moment, I'm just going to say classic WoW because I just want to play an MMO, damn it. But like realistically, I would say Camelot Unchained because, again, I just love the idea of giving players the tools to create the kind of content that they create. The only problem I'll say is that game isn't open faction system. It does have factions, which is a little bit of like a me, but I'm excited about that game. I'm excited about Star Citizen if that ever becomes anything significant. Just to see the possibilities. I don't just look at things as a consumer anymore. Of like, oh, I want to play games because I do, and I do want to play good games. But I also have to look about it as like, does this push the envelope forward? And if you ask why do you care about that? It's because otherwise we're gonna keep making the same game. And sorry, but that's not what we want, guys, because MMOs aren't where we want them to be yet. They're not this virtual reality, the Matrix thing that we want them to be yet. We need to get them there by continuing to innovate and pushing the envelope. How do you like my XP idea? I read through it a little bit. Obviously, I was in the middle of a conversation. I do, first off, like the idea of players being able to assign quests to other people, but I always come back to that same problem that you kind of outlined, which is like, at what point can you exploit it, or how do you prevent it from being exploited? That's one of those things where it's like, I love player-created quest systems, just like the Chronicler and Galaxies that I never shut up about. I love those systems, but it's like, how do you do it where you can also balance it like the Foundry system as well, and Star Trek, like to where people can't just like take advantage of the rewards or whatever else. It's a bit difficult to sorry if I'm cutting out, moving further away from my microphone. But it's difficult to do it without making it like exploitable, I guess. So I'm not going to say that you can't do it. Maybe, as you said, tie it around the idea of when you give somebody a quest, it gives them a percentage of your XP as well, which is an interesting idea, because then essentially you're forcing players to interact with each other. Because similar to the feudalistic system from Asheron's Call, you're making it to where that OG player wants to give people a quest because it's also going to benefit him as well. So maybe you're just telling someone to go kill 5 rats, but maybe he needs those 5 rats because he needs rat blood, or like whatever it is. Testing is done with agile and iterative development, and that's the thing. To go back to what somebody, I think it was you, Rippies, asked about how do you have like a structured PvP system and it kind of work? And it's like, I know I didn't fully answer that question because it's honestly a pretty hard question to answer. One that I thought a lot about too, so I have a lot to say about it. But to go into what Valinar was saying here, it absolutely does have to be iterative development. And that's the hardest part about running an MMO, is that it's not just about, oh, whoops, I made a mistake, let's fix it before the game comes out, or let me fix it in my next patch cycle. It's like, I created a bug which everybody is exploiting, which means I must fix this in the next day or hour, otherwise my whole economy in my entire game on the server is fucked. You see the stakes here? They're way greater. Not only are you doing development at a large scale, you're doing it at a massive scale, right? With big, massive MMOs and things like that. But you're also having to do it on the fly. And what if you make a wrong decision? You won't know until after you lost the players. And after you lost the players in an MMO, it's not like you can just easily get them back, right? It's not a matter of, oh, Steam sale, come join our game. It doesn't work that way for MMOs because people won't play dead MMOs. They won't. Not oftentimes. I'm saying people as in like the majority of people. Sorry, I know many of you will. I do too, but not to be a hypocrite, but I'm just saying like the majority of people won't. Like the Steam Grand Prix quest system exploit. I've heard about that, but I don't even know if I should talk about it. Anyway, I've reached the end of the podcast. I want to thank everybody for stopping by again. Thank you for joining me on the 1st of July. It's been awesome. The reception for my Gotham City Imposters video has been amazing. That video blew up way past my expectations, honestly. Like, I can't even front, I can't deny that. That video blew up way more than I thought it would. So thank you for that. That helps me be able to afford to keep doing this kind of stuff. So, yay. Nerd Slayer can eat for another month and live for another month. So thank you for the support on that video. I appreciate it, guys. I hope you will enjoy my next video, which is another shooter, this time on Quake Champions, which, me being a big arena shooter fan, I have a lot to say about that, and I'm very conflicted too. I don't know what to think exactly yet, so that's when I really get interested into making these stories and doing these Death of the Games, is when I have to figure it out myself. I'm not just this like sage who just picks up his fedora and all of a sudden, like, I know everything. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't have all of this stored up here. What I have in here is the framework to interpret the data. And I have to go find the data. So it's like, good place to start. Sure, you start with Wikipedia. A lot more than just that. Maybe you use Wayback. Maybe you have to go back and pull up old articles and search through different time periods so you can get very specific articles that say specific things you're trying to say. Maybe you look for developer interviews in which they admit certain things. Maybe you, I don't know, maybe you read through reviews and try and see where there's a lot of commonality between. It's all about research, and so I'm excited about the Quake Champions one because there's just so much that I don't know, which makes me excited. Because I played the game, and I had an opinion about the game, but that's a lot different than trying to make a macro assessment of a game. And that's what I think a lot of people don't get, is they might make an argument like, oh, but how many hours did you put in Quake Champions? I don't know, maybe a couple dozen hours in Quake Champions, right? Was I a pro at it? Probably not. But do I need to be a pro to understand that I've been playing Quake games since before that and had been playing arena games since before that? And by the way, also know how shooters are supposed to function in terms of their multiplayer functions. And maybe they shouldn't just magically switch business models in the middle of their development when they're still early access and then release no new content and then admit that they're releasing no new content. See? Now we have an interesting story. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for joining me today. See you later. Peace.